Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Dr. Evelyn Carter sat hunched over her desk, the dim glow of the computer screen casting an eerie light on her face. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, typing furiously as numbers, formulas, and microscopic images of bacteria filled the screen. The lab was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of test tubes in the far corner. It was late, later than usual, but she wasn't concerned. Not tonight. Tonight, she was on the verge of history. The research she'd been working on for months, no, years, was finally paying off. The lab animals she'd been testing on were showing incredible promise, and the results were nearly too good to be true. A new strain of bacteria, genetically engineered to improve gut health and optimize digestion, was thriving in the most unlikely of environments. The animals were gaining weight, absorbing nutrients they could never have processed before, and their overall health was improving at a remarkable rate. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for, the key to solving a problem that had plagued humanity for centuries. Malnutrition. It was a global epidemic, one that claimed the lives of millions every year. And Evelyn was determined to be the one who cured it. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes as she glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. She should have gone home hours ago. Her exhaustion was catching up with her, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for rest later. She had a human trial scheduled for the morning, and she needed everything to be perfect. Ben, the volunteer, was in his mid-30s, underweight, suffering from severe food allergies, and eager for a chance at a normal life again. She had chosen him carefully, knowing his condition would give the bacteria its best chance to succeed. The excitement in her chest was almost unbearable. This could change everything. She swiveled in her chair, glancing at the sterile lab equipment lining the walls. Her gaze landed on the sealed container of the bacteria. It looked harmless, even innocuous, but Evelyn knew better. She had worked tirelessly to develop this strain, carefully tweaking its genetic makeup to maximize its potential. It wasn't just any bacteria, it was designed to thrive in the human gut and improve the digestive process. It would help the body absorb nutrients with unprecedented efficiency. No more hunger pangs, no more malnutrition. A cure. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the file on her desk. The official documentation for the human trial. It was a risk, she knew that. The approval had come through, but she still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something could go wrong. There was always a chance, no matter how small, that the bacteria could act unpredictably. She was willing to take that risk. She had to. Her fingers brushed the corner of the file, but just as she was about to open it, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. She didn't need to look up to know it was Dr. Mitchell, her lead colleague, and the one person she trusted in this project. He had been skeptical of her research from the beginning, but even he couldn't deny the success they'd seen with the animal trials. Evelyn, Mitchell said as he entered the lab, his voice steady but tinged with a trace of concern. "You're still here." She turned in her chair, offering him a quick smile. "Can't sleep. Not with everything on the line tomorrow. We're ready, Mitchell. This is it." Mitchell glanced at the data on the screen and raised an eyebrow. "It looks like it's working, but you know we have to be careful, right? One wrong move, and we could set this whole thing back months, maybe even years." Evelyn waved him off. "I know the risks, but I've accounted for everything. This is going to work. Ben's the perfect candidate. His body's practically a blank slate. If this bacteria can fix his gut issues, imagine what it could do for people all over the world. We're on the brink of something huge, Mitchell." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying I don't believe in this. I do, but just don't get too ahead of yourself. This isn't just about curing malnutrition. You're playing with something unpredictable. You've seen how it behaves in the animals, but a human body. It's different. Evelyn nodded, feeling the weight of his words, but her determination was unwavering. I've prepared for every scenario. I'm confident we can control it. We have to. Mitchell hesitated, then moved toward the counter where the bacteria sample sat in its glass jar. He studied it for a moment, then looked back at Evelyn. All right, just promise me you'll be careful. Tomorrow's a big day. Don't let the excitement cloud your judgment. I won't, Evelyn said with a reassuring smile. Thanks, Mitchell. I'll see you tomorrow. As Mitchell left, Evelyn sat in silence for a moment, staring at the jar. She could feel her heart racing in her chest. Years of sleepless nights and countless failures. And now, the moment was finally here. She wouldn't let it slip away. With a deep breath, Evelyn stood and turned off the computer. She grabbed the file for the human trial and headed toward the door. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something remarkable. She could feel it. It was only a matter of time before the world would know her name. The next morning arrived far too quickly, and Evelyn barely managed to sleep. She had spent the night running through every possible scenario, mentally rehearsing every detail of the procedure. The lab felt cold, sterile, and clinical, as it always did, but today there was a certain buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation that made her skin prickle. She walked through the corridors of the research facility, her footsteps echoing against the white walls, carrying the weight of the hours ahead. As she passed by the labs of her colleagues, she couldn't help but notice the subdued looks they gave her, some curious, some skeptical. But Evelyn didn't let it distract her. Today, she was the one who would prove them all wrong. In the observation room, Ben was already prepped and ready for the procedure. He sat on the gurney, pale, but with a look of quiet resolve in his eyes. He had signed the consent forms yesterday, fully aware of the risks. Evelyn's heart gave a little tug when she saw him. He reminded her of her younger brother, back before everything had fallen apart. Ben was a good man. This was a second chance for him. She couldn't fail him. Not now. Good morning, Ben, she said as she approached him, offering a reassuring smile. How are you feeling? Ready, he replied, his voice raspy but steady. He didn't look frightened, just determined. I trust you, Dr. Carter. Whatever happens, I'm ready. Evelyn nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for him. It wasn't every day someone volunteered for an experiment like this, especially one with as much unknown potential. He had been living with severe malnutrition for years, and he had nothing to lose. For him, this was hope. She checked the vitals monitor by his side, ensuring everything was in order. The small needle containing the bacterial culture was already prepared and sterilized, ready to be injected into his bloodstream. The bacteria would then travel to his gut, where it would begin its work. Everything looks good, Evelyn said, turning to the rest of the team. Let's begin. As the procedure started, she watched Ben closely. The needle slid smoothly into his arm, and the liquid began to flow into his bloodstream. For a moment, nothing happened, but Evelyn knew better than to expect instant results. The bacteria would need time to settle in and adapt. She had developed it to be slow-acting at first, ensuring that it wouldn't overwhelm the system all at once. Once the injection was complete, she stepped back and glanced at her colleague, Dr. Mitchell, who was observing from the nearby station. He gave her a small, cautious nod. Now we wait, Evelyn said softly. Her voice almost caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down. It was too early to feel any sense of victory. This was only the beginning. Hours passed, and the initial excitement began to wane. The lab's fluorescent lights hummed in the background as Evelyn stared at the monitors. Ben's vitals were stable, and there was no sign of immediate rejection. She checked the data again, feeling her pulse quicken slightly. Everything seemed to be working. Then came the first sign of something different. Ben shifted on the gurney, a low groan escaping from his throat. At first, Evelyn thought it was just discomfort from the injection site, but the sound grew louder, almost primal. He turned his head toward her, eyes wide, pupils dilated in shock. "Dr. Carter, I'm starving," he said, his voice strained. I don't know why. I can't stop thinking about food." Evelyn frowned. It wasn't unexpected. After all, the bacteria was designed to help regulate digestion. But hunger wasn't usually a symptom this quickly. She took a step closer, watching Ben's body closely as he shifted again, his fingers twitching at the edges of his gown. His stomach rumbled audibly, like an animal on the hunt. "Ben, try to relax. Your body's adjusting to the bacteria," Evelyn said, trying to remain calm. "It's normal to feel hungry at first. It should stabilize soon." But Ben's breathing grew heavier, more erratic. He clenched his fists and sat up with a sudden, jerking motion. His face had drained of color, his lips pale, but his eyes were wild. They flicked back and forth, looking for something, anything to consume. "I need to eat," he gasped. Please, I need food now." Evelyn's stomach twisted with unease, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of her neck. This wasn't what she had expected. Not this quickly. She moved to calm him, but before she could reach him, Ben suddenly sprang to his feet. His body, previously frail and weak, now seemed to have a strength she hadn't anticipated. His hands shot out, knocking over a tray of medical supplies, the scattered instruments clinking loudly as they hit the floor. "Ben, stop," Evelyn shouted, her voice rising with panic. "It's going to be okay." But Ben wasn't listening. His face was twisted in desperation as he stumbled toward the counter, where a bowl of gelatin sat, an early snack for the trial. Without hesitation, he grabbed the bowl and shoved it into his mouth, devouring it with frantic speed. Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. It was as though he couldn't even taste the food, his body moving purely on instinct, ravenous, desperate. "That's not normal," Mitchell said, his voice low. "Something's wrong." Evelyn's mind raced. She reached for the medical data on her tablet, trying to assess Ben's condition, but before she could, the hunger took a far more disturbing turn. Ben's stomach swelled. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as his body seemed to stretch and contort under the pressure. The sight was grotesque. His skin appeared to tighten, and beneath it, something twisted, something wrong. Ben, you have to stop," Evelyn pleaded, but it was too late. Ben's eyes locked onto her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. A dark, primal hunger gleamed in his pupils. And then, as though something inside him finally snapped, he lurched forward, collapsing against the table, his hands clawing at the surface. "I can't. Stop," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so hungry." Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was terribly wrong. The bacteria was no longer just helping him digest. It was taking control. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the emergency injector on the counter. The first symptoms were only the beginning. She had underestimated how quickly it could take over. But as Ben let out a guttural cry, Evelyn realized with growing horror that there would be no easy fix. She had just unlocked something far darker than she had ever imagined, and there was no going back. The room seemed to close in around Evelyn as she backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. Ben's body was no longer responding to any of her commands. His once ravenous hunger had become something far worse, something uncontrollable, almost monstrous. His chest heaved with each desperate breath, and his stomach was distended, as if it were about to burst. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "Ben, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't you. This isn't what we planned." But Ben didn't respond. His gaze was vacant, unfocused, as if something else had taken over. He reached out blindly, knocking over a tray of medical instruments, his hands shaking with what appeared to be an insatiable hunger. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the sense of impending disaster. Evelyn's fingers moved quickly, swiping through her tablet, looking for any sign of something that might reverse this. The emergency protocol for unforeseen reactions to the bacteria should have been straightforward. There should have been a way to counteract it. But as she scanned the data, her heart sank. The bacterial culture wasn't just digesting food. It was overpowering Ben's body. It was taking control of his metabolism, warping his very biology. Her mind flitted to the notes she'd written late last night. Notes that had seemed so harmless, almost trivial at the time. Control is key. Gradual integration of the bacteria is essential. Monitor for overproduction of the digestive enzymes. She had pushed the boundaries, taken shortcuts. She had assumed she could handle it. But the bacteria was adapting, mutating faster than she could track, and now was running rampant through Ben's system. "Mitchell," Evelyn shouted, her voice cracking as she turned toward the observation window. He had been frozen in place, watching the unfolding horror, but he snapped out of his stupor when he heard her call. "Get the containment protocol," she ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to isolate him before this spreads." But Mitchell hesitated. "Containment. Are you sure? It could make things worse." "I don't care," Evelyn snapped. "We have no choice. Do it now." He hesitated a moment longer, but then rushed out of the room, leaving Evelyn alone with the man who had once seemed so normal, so hopeful. Now he was an unrecognizable shadow of himself, pale, his veins protruding unnaturally, his skin slick with sweat, and his breath ragged and shallow. Evelyn couldn't breathe. The lab was spinning around her. She could hear Ben's frantic, guttural gasps, his body twitching violently, as if he were possessed by some unseen force. She rushed to his side, but before she could reach him, Ben suddenly lurched toward her with alarming speed. His hands, clawed, trembling, and sticky with saliva, grasped at the edges of her coat, pulling her close. She could feel his hot, desperate breath on her face. "Please, Evelyn, help me," he gasped, his voice hoarse and frantic. I'm so hungry." Evelyn's stomach churned as she looked into his eyes. There was a flicker of the man he had once been, but it was buried beneath layers of need. Hunger. She grabbed his hand and tried to pull it away from her. "Ben, you need to fight it. You need to fight the hunger. We can still fix this." But his grip only tightened, and his face contorted in pain. He grunted, his teeth gritting as if the agony of the hunger was unbearable. "I can't. It's too strong." Just then, Mitchell returned, carrying a small emergency kit. "I've got the containment field set up. We need to sedate him now." His voice was thick with dread. Evelyn hesitated, her mind torn between the instinct to help and the terror of what might happen next. "Sedate him?" she whispered, eyes wide. "What if the sedation makes it worse?" "We don't have time to think about that," Mitchell said, pulling the syringe from the kit and filling it with a tranquilizer. "If we don't act now, we're going to lose him and the outbreak will spread. Do you want to risk it?" She didn't answer. She simply nodded. The situation had already spiraled beyond what any of them could have imagined. "Ben," she said softly, taking his trembling hand in hers, "I'm sorry. We're going to help you. Just hold on." Before Ben could respond, Mitchell stepped in, quickly injecting the syringe into his arm. Ben flinched, his body jerking, and for a brief moment, his grip on Evelyn loosened. His pupils dilated even more, his body trembling uncontrollably. Then, it was as if the lights flickered out in his eyes. His body went slack, and he collapsed against the gurney, his chest rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. Evelyn's heart was racing as she looked at the monitors. The tranquilizer was working, but it hadn't brought him back, only silenced the frenzied hunger, leaving him in a deep, unnaturally still sleep. The bacteria still pulsed within him, alive and growing, but there was no immediate threat of violence anymore. For now, the danger had passed, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that settled over her. This was only the beginning. The bacteria wasn't just a cure. It was a force. "Mitchell, we need to study this. We need to understand what we're dealing with before it spreads any further. It's not just hunger anymore. It's evolving. Mitchell's eyes were dark with the weight of what had just occurred. "I don't think we're going to be able to control this, Evelyn. Not anymore." Evelyn stood in silence for a long moment, staring at Ben's unconscious form. The hope that had fueled her for so long was now a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing fear she couldn't ignore. They had unlocked something they didn't understand, and there was no telling what it would do next. The hours that followed were a blur of tests, data analysis, and frantic discussions. The lab, once filled with excitement and optimism, now felt like a ticking time bomb, the weight of what they had done pressing down on Evelyn's chest. She sat at her workstation, running calculations and cross-referencing her results, trying to make sense of what had happened. Ben was still unconscious, but his vitals were stable, too stable. He should have been recovering by now, but there was no sign of improvement. In fact, there was something off. Something that sent a chill through Evelyn every time she checked the monitors. His heart rate, while steady, was unnaturally slow, and his oxygen levels were dipping lower than they should have been, as if his body was no longer functioning properly. "What have we done?" she whispered under her breath, feeling a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Mitchell paced in the corner, his face drawn with exhaustion and dread. "The bacteria, it's doing something to him, something we didn't account for. It's not just in his gut anymore, is it?" "No," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. It's in his bloodstream. His cells, they're changing. I can see it in the markers." Mitchell stopped pacing and turned to her, his face pale. "Changing? How?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The bacteria, in its rapid mutation, wasn't just optimizing digestion. It was altering the very structure of Ben's biology. His cells were dividing at an accelerated rate, his tissues becoming more efficient in absorbing nutrients. But that efficiency was coming at a horrific cost. His body was no longer functioning in the way it should. It was as if the bacteria was trying to take over his body to make it more suited to its own survival. And then, the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about feeding Ben. This bacteria was trying to consume him from the inside out. "It's not about survival anymore," Evelyn muttered, her hands shaking as she examined the data more closely. "It's feeding. The bacteria is feeding off of Ben's own cells. It's using him as a host to grow." Mitchell's face went ashen. But that's not possible. We designed it to work symbiotically. It was supposed to help, not do this." "I know," Evelyn said, clenching her fists in frustration. "But somewhere along the way, we triggered something we couldn't control. And now it's too late." The quiet beeping of the heart monitor cut through the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn's mind raced, desperately trying to find a solution. She couldn't accept that everything they had worked for had been in vain. She refused to believe that the cure she had created had turned into a nightmare. But deep down, she knew they were running out of time. Ben's body was deteriorating faster than she could understand. Suddenly, the monitors beeped erratically, and a loud, jarring sound filled the room. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She spun around to see that Ben's heart rate was spiking. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and the veins on his neck bulged as if something was forcing its way through him. No, Evelyn gasped, rushing to his side. "Ben, wake up. Can you hear me?" But Ben's eyes remained closed, and his breathing grew more labored. His body was trembling, and the unnatural hunger in his expression seemed to deepen. "What's happening to him?" Mitchell asked, voice tight with fear. "I think," Evelyn's voice faltered, "I think the bacteria is reaching the next stage. It's adapting too quickly. It's turning him into something else." As if to punctuate her words, Ben's body spasmed violently, and he let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was more animal than human. Evelyn recoiled, her blood running cold. This wasn't just the hunger. This was something else. It was as if the bacteria had begun to rewrite his very nature. Evelyn reached for the syringe of sedative, but just as she grasped it, Ben's eyes snapped open. They weren't human anymore. The pupils were dilated, nearly black, and his irises were clouded with something unrecognizable. He blinked once, twice, before locking eyes with Evelyn. The hunger was still there, but now it was replaced with something darker, more primal. A predatory gleam that made her stomach twist. "Ben," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "Ben, if you can hear me, please, fight it. You have to fight it." But Ben didn't respond. His mouth parted in a slow, deliberate motion, his teeth elongated, sharp, jagged. His lips pulled back in a horrific grin, as if he were savoring the moment. And then, without warning, he lunged at her. Evelyn barely had time to react. She staggered backward, narrowly avoiding his grasp as he snapped his jaws in the air, the sharp edges of his teeth just inches from her throat. His body had become unnaturally fast, unnaturally strong, as if the bacteria had given him abilities far beyond what a human should possess. "Mitchell, help me!" Evelyn screamed, backing into the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, frozen in fear, before grabbing a nearby restraint and swinging it toward Ben. But it was no use. Ben was too fast, his movements erratic and fueled by an unrelenting drive to feed. He swung around, knocking Mitchell to the ground with terrifying ease, his hands reaching for the nearest object to continue his assault. Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't let Ben hurt anyone, not like this. She had to do something. But what? She was out of time, out of options. With shaking hands, she grabbed the emergency injector once more, her fingers trembling as she aimed it at Ben. "I'm sorry, Ben," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Before she could inject him, Ben lunged again, knocking the syringe from her grasp. His breath was ragged, his body trembling as the bacteria inside him continued to devour him from the inside out. It was as if he were losing control over his own instincts, his own humanity. And then, with a final, terrifying lunge, Ben's teeth sank into Evelyn's arm. She screamed in agony, the pain searing through her like fire. The sensation of his teeth digging into her flesh was the last thing she remembered before everything went black. The world around Evelyn felt distant, as though she were floating in a dark, muffled haze. Her senses were dull, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of what had just happened. Pain, sharp and burning, throbbed through her arm where Ben had bitten her, but it was fading, becoming a distant echo in the storm of confusion and fear swirling inside her. She could hear voices now, faint and distorted, like someone calling her name from far away. "Evelyn, Evelyn, stay with us." It was Mitchell's voice. His tone was frantic, laced with panic. She tried to respond, tried to move, but her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive. It was as if something was pulling her deeper into unconsciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and the sterile white lights of the lab burned against her vision. She winced, trying to adjust, but her body felt cold, numb. Slowly, she became aware of the pressure on her arm, the tight bandages wrapped around her, the pulse of pain still throbbing beneath them. "Mitchell," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "What? What happened?" "You were bitten," Mitchell said, his voice tight. "We had to sedate you. You were losing consciousness." And Ben, his voice broke, and Evelyn felt a pang of fear clutch at her heart. She tried to sit up, but Mitchell gently pushed her back down. "Don't move. You've lost a lot of blood. You need to rest." But Evelyn wasn't listening. She was already trying to make sense of what had happened. Ben had bitten her, infected her, and the horror of it started to sink in. The memory of Ben's eyes, black and wild, the way his body had twisted, changed, and the pain. She could still feel the ghost of his teeth sinking into her flesh, a mark that seemed to burn beneath her skin, even though the immediate wound had been treated. That wasn't just a bite. It wasn't just an attack. "Mitchell, tell me everything. What happened to Ben?" Her voice was sharp now, urgent. She needed to understand. Mitchell paused for a moment, his face tense with dread. "Ben's gone, Evelyn. Whatever this bacteria did to him, it's taken him over. He's not human anymore. Evelyn's heart thudded painfully in her chest. What are you saying? He's dead. No, Mitchell said, his eyes dark with fear. He's still alive, but he's not been anymore. His body's been completely taken over by the bacteria. We've locked him in the containment room for now, but he trailed off, looking away. I don't know how much longer we can keep him in there. His body is mutating at an accelerated rate. His instincts are out of control. We're no longer dealing with a disease. We're dealing with something far worse. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to push back the rising panic in her chest. She had caused this. She had created something that was now far beyond her ability to control. Did he infect anyone else? Did it spread? Her voice trembled with fear. We don't know, Mitchell replied, his eyes filled with guilt. We've been monitoring the facility. So far, no signs of anyone else being affected. But Evelyn, you were bitten. And I don't know what that means for you. Evelyn's stomach lurched. She hadn't dared to think about it, but now the full weight of her situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The bacteria, the infection, it had already taken over Ben's body, twisted it into something monstrous. And now, it had infected her. She didn't know what it would do to her, but the fact that it was in her bloodstream sent a cold shiver down her spine. How long before something happens to me? She asked, her voice hollow. Mitchell's expression was unreadable, but there was fear in his eyes. I don't know, Evelyn. This is uncharted territory. The bacteria, it could mutate in your system. It could start changing you. I wish I could give you an answer, but we don't have one. A deep silence settled over them, broken only by the soft hum of the lab's machinery. Evelyn's thoughts raced, the fear of what the infection might do to her mingling with the knowledge that Ben, her friend, her patient, was lost. And it wasn't just him. It was her, too. She was already part of this nightmare. For a long time, they both sat there in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. The lab that had once been filled with the hum of progress and the thrill of discovery now felt suffocating. Evelyn had dreamed of changing the world, of helping people. But instead, she had unleashed something that could destroy everything. Finally, Mitchell spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost a whisper. We need to make a decision, Evelyn. If the infection is going to spread, if it's going to mutate, we have to do something before it's too late. We can't just sit here and wait for it to take over. Evelyn clenched her jaw, her eyes fixed on the sterile white walls, trying to force the thoughts from her mind. But the reality was inescapable. She had a choice to make. She had to decide whether to keep pushing forward, trying to find a solution, or to end it now before it spread any further. What if it's already too late? She whispered. We don't know that, Mitchell said, shaking his head. But we have to act, for everyone's sake. Evelyn looked at him, her hands trembling as she sat up, still weak from the blood loss. Then we find a way to stop it, no matter the cost. They both knew what it would mean. If she was going to stop it, if she was going to find a way to reverse the damage, it would come at a price. There was no turning back. The bacteria had already changed the course of their lives, and now it was up to Evelyn to stop it before it could destroy everything. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the cold sweat that clung to her skin betrayed the fear she could no longer hide. The path ahead was murky, shrouded in uncertainty and dread. She didn't know what the bacteria was doing to her body, but one thing was clear: time was running out. Mitchell leaned against the lab bench, his arms crossed, his eyes dark with worry. We need to come up with a plan. We can't afford to waste any more time. Ben's transformation. It's happening fast, Evelyn. If we don't act soon, there won't be anyone left to save. The urgency in his voice echoed in her chest. She could feel it, an unsettling stirring deep within her, a gnawing sensation she couldn't quite explain. The infection was inside her now. It was only a matter of time before it started to change her, too. We'll need to study the bacteria further, she said, her voice a little stronger now. We need to understand its full life cycle. What makes it spread, how it evolves. I can't stop it if I don't know how it works. Mitchell nodded. Agreed, but we're on borrowed time here. I'll prepare the sample analysis and start isolating the strain from Ben's blood. If we can find the mutation, maybe we can find a way to reverse it. Evelyn turned toward the computer terminal, her mind already working on the next steps. She pulled up the data from Ben's blood tests, searching through the images and charts that had only just started to make sense to her. The bacteria was more complex than she had anticipated, more adaptive. What they had initially believed was a biotic organism had mutated into something that no longer followed the rules of biology they knew. Then, her eyes froze on something. A new marker had appeared on the charts, something that hadn't been there before. The bacteria was no longer just feeding on the cells in Ben's body. It was integrating with them. In a horrifying twist, it was beginning to blend its genetic code with Ben's. The lines between host and parasite were blurring. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath hitching as she digested the implications. If the strain was mutating so quickly, it was possible that the same thing was happening inside her own cells. Mitchell, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of dread and realization. It's not just consuming the body, it's rewriting the DNA. His face paled as he moved to her side. What does that mean? It means that whatever happens to Ben, it could happen to me too, she said, her voice barely audible. And faster. I don't have the same. Strength. I don't have his endurance. The mutation could spread through my body like wildfire. A silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Mitchell's eyes darted to the containment room across the lab, where Ben was still locked inside, his condition deteriorating. There was no mistaking the desperation in his eyes. You're not just fighting a disease, Evelyn, he said softly. You're fighting for control over your own body, and that's something none of us were prepared for. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea roll through her, her body swaying slightly. The weight of what she had done, of what they had unleashed, was pressing down on her chest. She had created this, she had started it, and now there was no way back. We have to stop this, she said firmly, shaking off the dizziness as best she could. We have to stop Ben from mutating completely. We need to isolate him and figure out how to reverse the process. If I can't find a way to reverse it, we need to at least find a way to contain it before it spreads. Mitchell nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. And what if it's too late for that? What if we can't stop it from getting worse? Evelyn didn't want to consider that possibility, but she couldn't ignore it either. There was no way of knowing how much time they had before the infection reached the point of no return. If they didn't find a solution soon, everything they had worked for would be lost. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her. There were no easy answers, no guarantees. The bacteria was unpredictable, its effects irreversible until they understood it fully. I'll go to the containment room, she said, her voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her. We'll get Ben under control. Then we'll figure out what's going on with the bacteria. If it's adapting this fast in him, it could be in my system already. I can't wait any longer. We need answers. Mitchell hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Evelyn, are you sure? You're in no condition to. I'm sure, she interrupted, meeting his eyes. I have to do this. She could feel the infection moving through her veins, cold and alien, an unwelcome presence inside her. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it take everything from her. Together, they walked toward the containment room, the low hum of the lab's machinery like a constant reminder of the ticking clock they were racing against. The door to the containment room slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing Ben's prone form inside the glass cell. His body twitched occasionally, but he was still unconscious. For now, Evelyn moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy with the weight of what was happening. There was no going back from this. We need to sedate him again, Mitchell said, breaking the silence. His body still rejecting the tranquilizer. It'll take more than a normal dose now. Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the lab around her. I'll prepare the serum. We can't take any chances. She moved quickly, gathering the necessary equipment, her mind focused on the task at hand. But her eyes couldn't help drifting back to Ben, to the strange, unnatural changes that were already starting to consume him. Whatever happened next, it was no longer just a matter of saving Ben. It was a matter of survival. And Evelyn had no idea if they could save anyone. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken as she prepared the syringe. Every movement felt heavier now, as if the weight of the situation had settled deeper into her bones. The infection was moving faster than she'd ever anticipated, its effects gnawing at her, threatening to consume her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. She glanced over at Ben, still lying motionless on the other side of the containment cell. But even in his stillness, something about him felt wrong. His body was too still. The slightest twitch, the faintest hint of movement, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of them. "Mitchell," she said quietly, not looking away from Ben. "Do you hear that? His breathing. It's too calm." Mitchell glanced at the monitors, his brow furrowing. "His vitals are stable, but I agree. It's almost like he's waiting." Evelyn's stomach churned. They both knew the bacteria was changing him, twisting him into something else, something beyond human. If it had reached the point of full integration with his body, they weren't dealing with a mere mutation anymore. They were dealing with something new, something that might not even be human. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. They needed to sedate him, keep him under control long enough to study the full extent of what was happening. She drew the sedative into the syringe, making sure the dosage was more than enough to put him down, and then looked at Mitchell. "Ready." He gave a small nod, but his eyes betrayed his hesitation. "As ready as we'll ever be." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. With deliberate steps, she moved toward the containment room, the syringe in her hand like a weapon. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and she stepped inside, feeling a strange pull, an almost electric charge in the air. The glass wall that separated them from Ben felt like a fragile barrier, one that wouldn't hold much longer. Ben lay there, his breathing even, his eyes still shut. But something in his posture, his unnatural stillness, made Evelyn's heart race. She could feel the weight of his presence, the alien force that had taken root inside him, pushing at the boundaries of what he once was. "Ben?" she called softly, though her voice shook. "Ben, it's Evelyn. We're going to fix this. We're going to..." Suddenly, Ben's eyes snapped open. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes, once filled with warmth and life, were now pitch black. There was nothing human about them. No recognition. No trace of the man she had known. Instead, there was only hunger. Ben's body jerked to life with terrifying speed. His limbs moved with unnatural fluidity, and in the blink of an eye, he was standing, pressing his palms against the glass, his black eyes locked on her. For a split second, Evelyn thought she saw a flash of recognition, a flicker of the Ben she had known. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a predatory gaze, something darker, more primal. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She stepped back instinctively, but her gaze never left him. She could see the veins in his neck pulsing with unnatural energy. His body was changing, morphing under the strain of the bacteria, growing stronger, faster, more dangerous. "Mitchell," Evelyn called, her voice rising in urgency. Ben banged against the glass, his fist striking it with a force that rattled the entire room. The sound was deafening, the sheer power of the blow unsettling. The containment room was designed to hold the most dangerous of specimens, but Evelyn could see the cracks forming along the glass. It wouldn't hold much longer. Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom. "Evelyn, get out of there now." But Evelyn couldn't move. She was frozen, caught between the reality of what was happening and the sheer horror of it all. Ben, her friend, her patient, was no longer a person. He was a weapon, a vessel for something far darker than she could have imagined. His eyes locked onto hers again, and this time she saw it. It wasn't just hunger, it was intelligence. "Ben," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to fight it. You have to fight it." Ben's lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth, his mouth widening impossibly as he let out a low, guttural growl. It was a sound that reverberated through the very walls of the lab, unnatural and chilling. And then, just as quickly as it had started, he lunged. The glass shattered in a shower of jagged pieces, splintering like fragile ice, and Ben was on her in an instant. Evelyn barely had time to react as the force of his body slammed into hers, knocking the breath from her lungs. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of her. But before she could regain her bearings, Ben was on top of her, his hands clamped down around her throat with terrifying strength. Evelyn gasped, clawing at his fingers, but it was no use. The bacteria had made him too strong, too fast. His grip tightened, cutting off her air supply as his black eyes stared into hers, filled with nothing but hunger. "Mitchell," she gasped, her vision starting to blur. "Help me." In her fading consciousness, she could hear the sound of footsteps, rushing footsteps, and then the loud hiss of the emergency oxygen being pumped into the containment room. The pressure around her throat loosened, and Ben's body was pulled away from her with a force that nearly tore her apart. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, her throat raw from the pressure. She tried to sit up, but her vision was swimming, her body weak from the sudden lack of oxygen. Mitchell was there, pulling her up and away from the chaos, his hands trembling as he helped her stagger to her feet. But his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at Ben, who was now caged in an emergency containment field, his form still thrashing, desperate to escape. You were right," Mitchell whispered, his voice shaky. "We're too late, Evelyn. It's already gone." Evelyn looked at Ben, her heart breaking. He was no longer human. The man she had known was lost, consumed by something she couldn't even begin to understand. And now, it was too late for them all. The lab was silent except for the frantic hum of the containment field, the eerie glow of its emergency lights casting harsh shadows across the room. Evelyn's chest heaved with shallow breaths, and her skin felt cold with the remnants of panic. The sharp, metallic taste of fear still lingered in the back of her throat, but her mind was already racing. Mitchell was beside her, his face pale, his hands shaking as he held her up. She could feel his grip tighten slightly, as if to steady both of them in the aftermath of the chaos. She glanced over at the containment field, where Ben now struggled violently, his body slamming against the transparent walls with a force that made the entire room tremble. The field was holding for now, but it was only a matter of time before it couldn't contain him any longer. "This is bad," Mitchell muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "This is far worse than I thought. He's changing so fast. This strain, this infection, it's completely rewriting him, Evelyn. I don't think we can stop it." Evelyn didn't respond right away. Her mind was still reeling from the shock of seeing Ben in his new, horrifying form. He had been her responsibility, her patient. She had promised to help him, to save him from whatever he was dealing with. And now, she had become part of the nightmare she had unleashed. She looked at Mitchell, her vision still hazy, but her resolve hardening. "We have to stop this. We can't just wait for him to tear everything apart. He's still in there, Mitchell. Ben is still in there somewhere." Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, willing herself to focus. There was no time for fear now. If there was any chance of saving Ben, or stopping whatever this infection had become, she needed to keep going. She couldn't afford a break now. Mitchell swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the containment field. "You're right, but how? We don't know enough. We've barely scratched the surface of what this thing can do. And what if it's already too late for him? What if? I'll find a way." Evelyn interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. "There's got to be something we can do. We need more data, We need to understand exactly how the bacteria is transforming him. We need to isolate its core function, figure out what triggers its mutations. Then we stop it. Mitchell looked at her, eyes wide with concern. You're not thinking clearly. The infection could already be in your system. I'm fine. Evelyn snapped, cutting him off. She knew what he was thinking, and she couldn't afford to focus on that right now. We need to act. I'm the one who started this. I'm the one who let it get this far. I won't just give up now. We'll stop this together. For a moment, they both stood there in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Finally, Mitchell gave a reluctant nod, though his face was etched with doubt. Okay, we do this your way. Evelyn glanced at the monitor displaying Ben's vital signs. His heart rate was off the charts, and his breathing was shallow, almost too shallow. She could hear him growling from behind the containment field, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the room. She clenched her fists, fighting the surge of terror rising in her chest. Let's get to the lab, Evelyn said, her voice cold with determination. We need to analyze the genetic markers of the bacteria. We need to isolate the part of the virus that's mutating him so rapidly. If we can identify how it's working, maybe we can reverse the damage. Mitchell nodded, though there was no hiding the concern in his eyes. All right, but be careful, Evelyn. We don't know how it will affect you if you're exposed to too much of it. You're already compromised. Evelyn didn't want to hear it. She couldn't afford to think about herself right now. The lab's main research facility was just down the hall, and she moved toward it with purpose, her mind sharp despite the fog of exhaustion. Mitchell followed closely behind, glancing nervously over his shoulder every few steps, as if expecting something to leap out at them from the shadows. The lab was still in disarray, papers scattered, equipment left half-finished from when they had abandoned their work to attend to Ben. Evelyn took a seat at one of the terminals, pulling up the files on the bacterial strain. The data was incomplete, fragmented. She frowned, scanning the charts quickly. Her mind raced, the pieces falling into place. But there was still something she didn't understand. The mutation. It was happening too fast. The strain was adapting in ways they hadn't predicted. Mitchell, I think the bacteria is fusing with Ben's DNA at an accelerated rate. Evelyn said, her voice quiet but urgent. It's not just using his cells for sustenance. It's changing them. It's evolving. This bacteria, it's become something else entirely. Mitchell leaned over her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the data. That would explain the strength, the speed, the intelligence. But if it's already changing his genetics, then there's no way to reverse it. Is there? If his DNA is permanently altered, we might not be able to fix it. Evelyn's mind raced. There has to be a way. If we can stop the mutation from spreading, if we can find a way to block its ability to overwrite his DNA, maybe there's a chance. We might be able to give him a chance to recover. She turned to the lab's chemical storage and began pulling out various compounds, trying to formulate a solution. The key was finding something that could interrupt the bacteria's ability to adapt, something that could prevent it from spreading to her or to anyone else in the facility. We don't have much time, Mitchell said, his voice tight with anxiety. The more time passes, the harder it will be to stop. If the infection gets into the air ducts or water supply. Evelyn didn't let him finish. She was already thinking too far ahead, already moving faster than her mind could keep up with. There had to be a solution. There had to be. She glanced once more at the monitor showing Ben's vitals. His heartbeat was accelerating again, and his body was thrashing against the containment field, his mouth frothing. The virus, the infection, whatever it was getting stronger. And with each passing second, they were getting closer to losing him forever. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder how long until it was too late for her to. Evelyn's fingers flew across the lab's controls, inputting commands and searching for a chemical solution that might halt the infection's rapid progression. Her mind raced, pulling together every piece of knowledge she had on bacteria, genetic mutation, and cell regeneration. But every time she tried to focus, her thoughts would spiral back to Ben, his once human face now twisted by. the infection. It was hard to focus when every inch of her body screamed with the overwhelming knowledge that she wasn't far behind him. Mitchell stood beside her, anxiously watching the clock tick down, his eyes darting between the data monitors and Ben's still thrashing form in the containment field. "We need to move faster," Mitchell said, his voice tight with fear. "He's going to break out of that containment field any minute, and we don't have the resources to keep him locked up once he does." "I know," Evelyn muttered. She couldn't ignore the growing panic in Mitchell's voice. She could feel it too. The air in the lab was thick with a heavy sense of impending doom. She had to stop it. She couldn't let it spread, not to anyone else. But how? A new wave of nausea swept through her, and her hand faltered as she reached for a vial of compound she'd once considered for unrelated studies. It was a synthetic enzyme inhibitor, one she had initially thought could be used to stabilize cell structures against mutation, though the testing had been limited. Could it work? "Mitchell," Evelyn said urgently, holding up the vial. "This could slow the mutation process down. We could try injecting it into Ben's bloodstream. It might not reverse the damage, but it could at least give us time to understand what we're dealing with." Mitchell stared at the vial, eyes narrowing. And what if it doesn't work? What if it makes things worse? Evelyn bit her lip, thinking quickly. If we don't try, we're out of options. We won't have any time to analyze the bacteria before it spreads through him completely. This might be our only chance to slow it down. We need to act now. Mitchell hesitated for a long moment, then nodded, swallowing hard. "All right, let's do it." They both moved toward the containment room. Evelyn's breath quickened as they entered the sterile environment. Ben was still thrashing against the force field, his movements erratic and unnatural, the primal growls and inhuman screeches filling the room. The sight of him, his face locked in a twisted grimace, his eyes black as ink, made Evelyn's heart ache. She had to stop this. She had to. Mitchell quickly checked the data on Ben's condition, monitoring the physical and biological parameters. "His vitals are fluctuating. We're running out of time." Evelyn quickly sterilized the needle and injected the enzyme inhibitor into the syringe. "We need to act fast. This could be our only shot." She approached the containment field, trying to steady her hand, but her stomach churned with fear. The last thing she wanted was to make the wrong move now. Ben's violent thrashing made the air feel thicker, suffocating, but she kept her focus. "Evelyn," Mitchell's voice was low, laced with caution. "If this doesn't work, there's no telling what he could do. His strength is off the charts. We might not be able to contain him." "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But if we don't try, it's over." With a deep breath, Evelyn moved closer to the containment field, carefully inserting the needle into Ben's arm, her eyes flickering briefly to the monitor. She watched as the syringe emptied into his bloodstream. The tension in her chest grew. The seconds stretched on as she waited, praying for any sign of change. Ben's body tensed, then went still. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Had it worked? Was it too late? Then, without warning, Ben let out a guttural scream. His muscles bulged as he slammed into the containment field once more, but this time there was a noticeable difference. His body shuddered, the violent spasms reducing in intensity, though the growls continued. Is he calming down?" Mitchell asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. Evelyn's eyes were fixed on the monitor, watching the changes in Ben's vital signs. His heart rate was still elevated, but it was slowing slightly. The erratic spikes in his oxygen levels were beginning to stabilize. It's working," Evelyn whispered, barely daring to believe it. "We've slowed it down, just enough." But before she could say more, the ground beneath her feet shook with a low, violent rumble. The room shuddered, and alarms blared, their shrill cry filling the lab. "What the hell was that?" Mitchell shouted, his eyes darting toward the wall, where the tremors continued to intensify. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she watched the monitors. It was the ventilation system. The alarm was signaling a breach in the facility's containment protocols. "They've breached the outer wall," she whispered, horrified. "The virus. It's spreading." Mitchell turned toward her, eyes wide. No. How is that possible? We've been isolating it. The air filters should have." Before he could finish, a muffled scream echoed through the hall outside the lab, cutting him off. The sound was low, primal. And then, scraping. A clawing, desperate sound. Something was moving out there. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The infection hadn't just spread to Ben. It was spreading through the facility, using the very ventilation system that was supposed to contain it. The air ducts were a perfect vehicle for the bacteria, carrying it throughout the building. "No," she breathed, her mind spinning with the horrific realization. "It's not just him. It's already in the air supply." She and Mitchell exchanged a look, the gravity of their situation settling over them like a suffocating weight. The infection was no longer confined to one person. It was about to reach the entire facility, and soon it would be out of their hands entirely. Evelyn's heart raced as the reality of their situation crashed over her. The infection was no longer contained within Ben. It was spreading through the very air they breathed, coursing through the ventilation system, contaminating everything it touched. There was no telling how far it had spread or how long they had before it reached the rest of the facility. She turned to Mitchell, her voice urgent and shaking. "We have to shut down the ventilation system. Now. If we don't, it will spread throughout the entire building, and we won't be able to contain it." Mitchell was already moving, his face pale but determined. "I'll get to the central control panel. You, stay with Ben. Keep an eye on him. Make sure the inhibitor continues to work." Evelyn nodded, though she could feel the weight of the decision in her gut. She didn't want to leave the control of the situation solely in Mitchell's hands, but time was running out. She turned her attention back to the monitor. Ben's vitals were still fluctuating, but the enzyme inhibitor had slowed the mutation. It wasn't reversing the damage, but it was buying them some time. She prayed that time would be enough. She watched as Mitchell ran out of the lab, heading toward the facility's central control room. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, and the room was once again filled with the low hum of the emergency systems. But now it felt different. The silence was heavy with a sense of impending doom. Ben was no longer thrashing against the containment field, but he was far from calm. His movements had slowed, but his body was still tense, every muscle coiled with the effort of resisting the effects of the infection. His breathing was shallow, his eyes locked onto Evelyn with an almost unnatural intensity. It was as though he could sense her presence, could feel the connection between them. Evelyn swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. She had known Ben for years. He had been a colleague, a friend, a human being. And now, standing in front of her, was something barely recognizable as him. She had tried to save him, tried to find a cure. But now, she wasn't so sure there was anything left to save. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the alarms. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." Ben's lips twitched, as if he were trying to form words, but the sound that emerged from his throat was something deep and guttural, nothing human. It was the sound of something desperate, something other than him. Evelyn took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ben, please." Her voice cracked, a tremor in her throat. She had to do something. She had to make this right. Suddenly, the ground shook again, this time more violently, and Evelyn staggered back. The alarms were blaring louder now, their shrill sound deafening. The entire facility was on high alert, and the low rumble of distant explosions reverberated through the walls. She could feel the tremors in her bones, and for a split second, she thought the entire building might collapse. She turned back to Ben, but his body was already starting to convulse again, his eyes now wide and unseeing. He was no longer focused on her, no longer anything resembling the man he had been. The infection had taken hold of him once more. and it was clear that the inhibitor was no longer enough to keep it at bay. "Mitchell!" Evelyn screamed, her voice raw with panic. She rushed toward the control panel, fingers trembling as she tried to access the emergency lockdown procedures. "Mitchell, you need to hurry." But as the seconds ticked by, she realized the horrifying truth. The air supply had already been compromised. It was already coursing through the facility, and no amount of shutdown procedures would stop it now. There was no stopping the spread, no stopping what had already begun. Ben's body jerked violently, and then, with a sudden, sickening crack, his bones seemed to break and reform all at once. His body contorted unnaturally, and he let out a blood-curdling scream, a noise so inhuman, so filled with rage, that Evelyn's knees nearly buckled beneath her. The containment field flickered. No! Her breath caught in her throat as the lights above her buzzed and dimmed. She watched, helpless, as the field started to warp and crack under the sheer force of Ben's thrashing. The monitors beeped loudly, flashing warnings that she couldn't comprehend. It was happening faster than they could anticipate. Evelyn looked around the lab in a panic, tried to make sense of the madness that was unfolding. The sound of footsteps pounding toward her snapped her out of her trance, and she spun around to see Mitchell, eyes wide, rushing into the room. "It's spreading," he gasped out of breath. "It's everywhere. The entire facility is compromised. We need to get out of here." Evelyn's eyes snapped to Ben's containment field, and her stomach twisted as she realized the glass was about to shatter completely. His body was changing too fast now, too violently. There was no holding him back. "Mitchell, we need to get out," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking as she backed away from the field, unable to take her eyes off of Ben. The look in his eyes, black, devoid of recognition, was a horrifying reminder that whatever had once been Ben was long gone. Whatever this was, it wasn't human anymore. But Mitchell wasn't listening. He was too focused on the control panel. "We can't just leave. We need to contain the infection somehow," he started, but the words died in his throat as the containment field let out a sharp, metallic screech, and then exploded. The force of the blast sent Evelyn flying backward. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air knocked out of her lungs. The room was filled with the sound of shattering glass and sparks flying from the broken control panel. Evelyn's mind swam as she struggled to regain her bearings, her vision blurring in and out. When she managed to sit up, she saw it. Ben, now a horrific, monstrous version of himself, stood in the center of the room, his body twisted and contorted in ways that defied nature. His jaw hung open in an unholy rictus, jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. His eyes were still black, but there was something even more terrifying in them now: intelligence. And then, in a voice that was a twisted mockery of Ben's own, it spoke. "Run." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as Ben's voice echoed through the lab. It wasn't his voice anymore, but something deeper, raspier, colder. Something born from the infection that had consumed him. The word that came from his mouth, "run," was more of a command than a plea. And in that moment, Evelyn knew there was no more humanity left inside of him. She scrambled to her feet, her body shaking from the impact of the explosion and the sheer terror flooding her system. The lab was a mess of broken glass and sparks flying from damaged equipment. The air was thick with smoke, and the once controlled environment had now descended into chaos. The floor beneath her feet felt unsteady, and her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her that she was running out of time. "Mitchell, we need to go. Now," she shouted, her voice hoarse as she turned to find him. Her eyes scanned the smoke-filled room, but she couldn't see him, couldn't hear him. A loud thud echoed from across the room as she turned just in time to see Mitchell stumble forward, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, and his face was pale with pain. "Mitchell!" Evelyn screamed, rushing to his side. She quickly assessed the injury. His side had been torn open by shrapnel from the explosion. There was no time to waste. "Get up!" she said, trying to sound as steady as possible, though her hand shook. "We have to go. We can't stay here." Mitchell grimaced, his face contorted in pain. I can't, Evelyn. You need to leave. You need to." "No," Evelyn snapped, her voice sharp, desperate. "I'm not leaving you behind. We're in this together." She helped him to his feet, her arms supporting him as they both staggered toward the exit. But as they moved, the sound of Ben's growls filled the air again, closer this time. Evelyn's stomach twisted, and her grip tightened on Mitchell, dragging him along even as he groaned in pain. They had no time to argue. "Move," she ordered, barely able to catch her breath as they reached the hallway. The lights above them flickered erratically, and the entire facility seemed to groan under the strain of whatever had happened. The infection was everywhere. They stumbled down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The building's emergency alarms were blaring now, the shrill sound cutting through the chaos, but they couldn't afford to stop. They had to escape. Behind them, the growling from Ben, no, whatever he had become, grew louder. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was a full-on scream, one that rattled the walls and made Evelyn's skin crawl. She turned just in time to see Ben. It charged down the hallway toward them, his form monstrous and twisted, limbs unnaturally long, his face a grotesque mask of rage and hunger. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she realized there was no way they would outrun him. "Go," she yelled, urging Mitchell forward, knowing she couldn't outrun Ben with his injuries. She needed to buy them time. With all her strength, Evelyn pushed Mitchell into the safety of the next hallway. The sound of Ben's footsteps pounding behind her made her heart race even faster. There was no room for hesitation. She scanned the walls frantically, trying to find anything that might give them an advantage. There, on the far side of the hallway, was a locked door. It led to one of the emergency evacuation tunnels. It was their only shot. "Mitchell, get to the tunnel. I'll lock it behind us," Evelyn shouted, throwing herself at the door. Her fingers fumbled with the keypad, but she managed to trigger the lock, the heavy steel door sliding open with a mechanical groan. Mitchell staggered toward the opening, but just as he reached it, a loud crash shook the hallway behind them. Ben was upon them. Evelyn shoved Mitchell forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "Get in, now!" Mitchell lunged for the door, just as Ben's horrific screech echoed behind them. Evelyn slammed the door shut with a deafening clang, and the entire tunnel system shuddered, as if protesting their hasty retreat. For a moment, there was silence. Evelyn pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath, but her mind was racing. She could still hear Ben's monstrous snarls on the other side, but it felt distant. She didn't know if the door would hold or if the creature would tear through it with its inhuman strength. She turned to Mitchell, whose face was drenched in sweat, his injury worsening by the second. She could see the strain in his eyes, the pain he was barely holding in check. "Mitchell, we need to get out of here. We need to find a way to stop this. The infection, it's everywhere now." Mitchell leaned against the wall, clutching his side. His breathing was shallow, and he looked exhausted, but he nodded. "I know, but first, we need to find medical supplies. I can't make it much longer without proper treatment." Evelyn took a deep breath. The tunnel stretched in front of them, dark and foreboding. But they had no choice. It was their only hope. "All right, let's go. We'll find a safe place and regroup. But after that, we stop this. We have to." As they moved down the darkened tunnel, Evelyn's mind kept replaying the horrifying image of Ben's monstrous transformation. She couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. Could they stop this? Could they reverse what had been done? Or had they unleashed something so dangerous that no one would ever be safe again? The echoes of Ben's growls still haunted her ears, a reminder that, for the first time in their lives, they were not in control. The virus was in control now, and they were only running out of time. Evelyn and Mitchell stumbled deeper into the tunnel, the dim emergency lights flickering overhead. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension and the ever-present feeling of something watching them, hunting them. Each step echoed off the cold, stone walls, a grim reminder that they were no longer in control. Whatever had been unleashed on the facility was beyond anything they had prepared for. Mitchell's breaths were labored, the blood soaking his side, worsening with each passing moment. Evelyn could feel the panic creeping up in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. She kept her focus, pushing forward, but the truth gnawed at her. They were running out of time. Ben's transformation, the spread of the infection, it was all happening too fast. How long could they survive? Mitchell, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. We have to find medical supplies. We can't keep going like this. He nodded weakly, his face pale and covered in sweat. I know, but where? Where do we even go? The infection's everywhere. The tunnels won't save us. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the facility. They were in the emergency evacuation tunnels, which led to a network of underground labs and storage areas. Some of these were stocked with medical supplies, enough to treat injuries, possibly even enough to help with the infection. But would it be enough to stop it? A faint noise broke her thoughts, a scratching, clawing sound from somewhere deeper within the tunnel system. Her heart skipped in her chest. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the dark. Mitchell's face went tight with fear. "It's them," he said, his voice trembling. They've already breached the system. We're not alone." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "It's spreading. It's already here." She grabbed Mitchell's arm and pulled him forward, her urgency rising. "We need to move faster. If we stay here too long, we're sitting ducks." They quickened their pace, but it was clear that Mitchell could barely keep up. His breaths were ragged, his body growing weaker with every step. Every now and then, he stumbled, and Evelyn had to steady him, forcing herself to focus. But her thoughts were divided. She couldn't afford to let him down, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that the walls around them were closing in. The infection was everywhere. It had already begun its spread through the facility. She could only imagine how much worse it had gotten since they'd escaped. The sound of the scratching grew louder, now accompanied by low, guttural growls. The infected were getting closer. Evelyn could feel their presence in the air, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "There's a medical station ahead," she said, trying to sound hopeful, though her heart sank with each passing second. She was trying to convince herself as much as Mitchell. Just a little farther. Mitchell's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with fear. "How? How are we supposed to fight them off? We can't outrun them. I can barely." She didn't let him finish. She kept pushing forward, forcing herself to ignore the fear rising within her. She could hear their footsteps now, echoing from the dark corners of the tunnel. She didn't know how many of them there were, but she could feel them closing in. The virus was evolving faster than they could keep up with, and it wasn't just humans infected anymore. She had seen the way Ben had changed, how he had become something else entirely, a monstrous thing driven by rage and hunger. "Stay close," she said tightly, keeping one hand on Mitchell's shoulder, guiding him as they moved down the narrow path. The scratching and growling grew louder, and then, without warning, a shadow lunged out from the darkness. A shrill scream split the air, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding against the stone floor. The figure was hunched and grotesque, its body twisted, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too angular. Its eyes glowed faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. It was faster than anything human had a right to be. "Mitchell moved," Evelyn shouted, shoving him forward as the infected figure lunged for her. She barely managed to dodge it, the creature's claws raking across her arm, leaving a trail of burning pain behind. She cried out, but didn't stop. Adrenaline surged through her as she grabbed Mitchell's hand and pulled him along, hearing the thumping, pounding footsteps of the creature right behind them. They reached a small alcove up ahead, a doorway that led into a supply room. Evelyn shoved it open with all her strength and pushed Mitchell inside. She slammed the door shut behind them, but the creature's claws scraped against the metal. It wasn't going to hold them for long. Inside the medical station, the air was damp and stale. Shelves lined the walls, filled with all sorts of medical equipment, bandages, syringes, vials of drugs, and several larger tanks that Evelyn recognized as emergency supplies. She quickly turned to Mitchell, her voice strained with urgency. "We need to patch you up now. I can't help you if you bleed out." He looked at her with wide, fearful eyes, but nodded. His breath was shallow, and his skin was growing paler with each passing second. Evelyn grabbed a first aid kit and began working quickly, trying to stop the bleeding from Mitchell's side. The sound of scratching at the door grew louder. She knew they didn't have much time before the creature outside broke through. Mitchell groaned in pain as Evelyn tightened the bandages, her mind racing. Was there anything in here that could help them? Some cure? Something to slow the infection down? A sudden hiss sounded from behind her. She spun around, but before she could react, a grotesque figure had already crawled through the vents, its body twisted beyond recognition. Another infected. And then, another one appeared in the doorway. They were surrounded. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she backed toward the far wall, pulling Mitchell with her. The supplies were useless if they didn't get out of here. "Mitchell, you have to stay with me," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have much time. The infection is going to take us both if we don't find a way out." Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find an escape. The sounds of the infected grew louder as they closed in on their position. There was no way out through the door, no way through the walls. And that's when she saw it, a small hatch near the ceiling, just large enough for one person to fit through. She grabbed Mitchell by the shoulders, urgency flooding her voice. "I'm getting us out of here. Climb." Evelyn quickly assessed the hatch. It was small, too small for both of them to fit through, but it was their only chance. They had to move, and fast. The infected were closing in, their growls and scratches echoing through the room like a countdown to their doom. "Mitchell, you're going first," she said, her voice sharp with the need for speed. She didn't give him time to protest, pulling him toward the hatch. "I'll cover you." Mitchell looked at her, panic in his eyes. His wound was bleeding through the makeshift bandages, and his movements were sluggish, his breath shallow. But he nodded, his expression resigned. Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes, but there was no time to comfort him now. They both knew it was every man for himself. She hoisted him up to the hatch and watched as he struggled to climb, his injured side making it difficult for him to lift himself. He grunted in pain, but pushed through, his fingers gripping the edge of the hatch as he slowly pulled himself through. Evelyn's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to help him, but her eyes kept flicking to the door. The sound of claws scraping against the walls was getting closer. The infected were almost there. "Come on, Mitchell, hurry," she urged, her voice trembling with the urgency of the moment. With one final, desperate pull, Mitchell managed to squeeze through the hatch, his body disappearing from sight. Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands shaking, and she reached for the latch. As she pulled herself up to the hatch, she could feel the cold sweat running down her back, could hear the infected growling louder and louder. She was almost through when a sharp, gnashing sound made her freeze. The first infected creature burst through the door, its twisted body lurching forward with unnatural speed. It screeched, a high-pitched, unholy sound that scraped at her very soul. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself up, her hands slipping slightly on the edge of the hatch, but she refused to stop. She felt the air move behind her, the sound of something charging toward her. Her fingers found purchase on the metal, and with one final effort, she pulled herself through the hatch and into the cramped tunnel beyond. She collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, gasping for air, her arms shaking from the exertion. She turned just in time to see the hatch slam shut behind her with a loud clang, and the sounds of the creature's snarls were muffled, but still relentless. They were trapped for now, but she knew it wouldn't be long before the infected found another way in. She lay there for a moment, catching her breath, before scrambling to her feet. Mitchell, her voice was hoarse, frantic as she looked around the narrow tunnel. The dim light of the emergency bulbs flickered above her, casting long shadows along the walls. She didn't know how much further they had to go, or if there was even a safe place left. Mitchell was leaning against the wall a few feet ahead of her, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. "I'm okay," he said, though the pain in his voice told another story. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep moving." Evelyn's heart twisted at the sight of him. She knew his injuries were far worse than he was letting on. They had to find help, and soon. "We'll make it," she said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "We're not giving up now." They moved forward, the tunnel stretching out endlessly in front of them. Each step felt like a challenge, the exhaustion weighing them down, but Evelyn refused to stop. They had come too far. They had to survive. They had to find a way to stop the infection from spreading further, or else they wouldn't just be fighting for their lives, they would be fighting for humanity's future. But as they walked, the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in on them. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of rot and decay. It felt as if the infection itself was alive, growing, pressing in from all sides. "Evelyn," Mitchell's voice broke through her thoughts, strained with pain. "Where are we going? There's no way out. The whole place is. It's infected. It's everywhere." Evelyn stopped, her heart sinking as she turned to face him. He was right. No matter how far they ran, the infection would catch up to them. They had no backup, no reinforcements. The world they knew was gone, and the nightmare they had unleashed was far bigger than they could have imagined. But still, she couldn't give up. Not yet. "We'll keep going," she said, her voice firm despite the doubt clawing at her insides. "There has to be a way. There has to be somewhere safe." Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his face pale and tired. But finally, after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Evelyn reached out and gripped his shoulder, giving him a quick, reassuring squeeze. "We'll find a way. We have to." They moved forward once again, the sound of their footsteps the only thing that filled the heavy silence. But as they pressed deeper into the tunnel, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The walls seemed to shift, the air thickening with the presence of something just beyond their reach. Something watching. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from somewhere ahead. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive darkness. Mitchell tensed beside her. "It's them," he said softly, his voice trembling. "The infected. They found us." Evelyn's heart raced as she scanned the tunnel ahead of them. She couldn't see anything, but she knew, deep down, that whatever was coming for them would not stop. They had to keep moving. But the sound of claws scraping against stone grew louder, closer. The infected were coming, and they weren't alone. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue, or if you want to adjust the direction." The sound of the claws scraping against the walls echoed through the tunnel, sending a shiver down Evelyn's spine. The infected were closing in, and there was nowhere to hide. She could hear their snarls, their guttural growls, each sound sending a cold wave of dread washing over her. "Mitchell, we need to move now," Evelyn hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. She could feel the heat of panic rising in her chest, but she didn't have time to let it consume her. She had to be strong for both of them. Mitchell staggered alongside her, his injured side bleeding again, the pain written clearly on his face. I don't know how much further I can go," he gasped, his voice weak, strained. Evelyn glanced back. The dim light barely revealed the forms of the infected emerging from the shadows, their twisted bodies lurching forward with unnatural speed. There were more of them now, at least 3, maybe more, and They were getting closer. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the exhaustion gnawing at her bones. They didn't have the luxury of slowing down. They were trapped in a labyrinth with no way out except forward. "There's a junction up ahead," she said, pointing toward a narrow path that veered off to the left. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only option. "We need to get there before they catch up." Mitchell nodded, though his face was pale and his movements sluggish. He was fading fast. They pressed on, the growls of the infected rising behind them. Evelyn could hear the rapid beat of her own heart in her ears, but she pushed it all aside, focusing only on the path ahead. There was no room for hesitation. They reached the junction, and Evelyn quickly scanned the new path. It was narrow, but it looked like it led to an old maintenance shaft, maybe an access point to the outside. It was their best chance. "Come on," Evelyn urged, pulling Mitchell toward the shaft. But just as they started to move down the new path, a deafening crash rang out from behind them. One of the infected had reached the junction, fast and relentless. It screeched, a terrifying sound that sent Evelyn's blood running cold. "We don't have time," Mitchell rasped, trying to push himself forward, his legs shaky beneath him. But it was clear he was growing weaker by the second. Evelyn reached the maintenance shaft and tried the door. It was locked, but only with a simple latch. With all the strength she had left, she shoved the door open, just as the first infected rounded the corner. She pulled Mitchell through the threshold, slamming the door behind them. The creature's claws scraped against the steel, and it let out a shrill screech, but the door held. For now. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving as she pressed her back against the door. She glanced around quickly. The maintenance tunnel was dim, lined with pipes and cables, but it seemed like it led to a larger space. It was their only option. She looked at Mitchell, who was still leaning heavily on her. "We're okay for now," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. "We'll keep moving, find another way out." Mitchell nodded, though his eyes were unfocused. He was slipping fast. The blood loss, the strain of their flight, it was catching up with him. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If I don't make it, you have to stop this. You have to. Find a way to stop it." Evelyn froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. She shook her head. "Don't talk like that. You're going to make it. We're not giving up. We can." But even as she said the words, she felt a growing sense of dread settle in her bones. Could they make it? Could they stop the spread of the infection? They had no answers. No cure. Only fragments of a nightmare they didn't understand. She grabbed Mitchell's hand, pulling him forward as they moved deeper into the maintenance tunnel. The flickering emergency lights barely illuminated the path ahead, but there was something else, something more menacing than the infected closing in behind them. The air had grown colder, the shadows darker, as if the infection itself was spreading through the tunnels, seeking them out. They came to a large, open chamber, the walls lined with old machinery and forgotten equipment. In the center, there was a raised platform with a control panel, likely part of the facility's emergency operations. Evelyn's eyes scanned the area, a sense of foreboding creeping up her spine. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and a loud, guttural roar echoed through the chamber. Evelyn whipped her head around, just in time, to see two more infected burst into the room, their twisted bodies moving at an unnatural speed. Their eyes were wide with rage, and their mouths dripped with saliva, their bodies writhing in unnatural contortions. Evelyn shoved Mitchell behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to think fast. The only way out was through. There was no choice but to fight to survive. She grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, swinging it in a wide arc as one of the infected lunged at her. The pipe connected with the creature's skull with a sickening crack, but it didn't stop. It recoiled for a moment, then came at her again, faster this time. She swung again, this time aiming for its throat. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech as it fell to the ground, twitching. but the second one was already upon her. She barely had time to react as it reached for her, claws extended. Her heart raced, her hand tightening around the pipe as she swung again. This time, the blow landed with enough force to send the creature stumbling back. Mitchell, still weak and pale, grabbing nearby pieces of metal and charged the creature from behind. He swung it wildly, hitting the infected square in the back, sending it crashing into a pile of debris. The creature screeched, but it didn't rise again. Panting, Evelyn glanced around. More were coming. They could feel the tremors in the ground beneath them. There were too many now. They couldn't fight forever. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "It's not safe here." Mitchell nodded, his face pale with exhaustion, but his resolve was still there. They had no choice. The infection was everywhere, and if they didn't keep moving, they'd become part of it. They turned, their footsteps echoing in the empty chamber as the growls of the infected grew louder once again. Time was running out. They had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. Evelyn and Mitchell moved through the chamber as quickly as they could, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The growls of the infected seemed to reverberate off the walls, getting closer and closer. The dark tunnel stretched endlessly ahead of them, but they couldn't afford to stop. Mitchell's pace had slowed further, his steps uneven as the blood loss sapped his strength. His face was ashen, his eyes dull with fatigue. Evelyn's mind raced. She knew they needed help, medical supplies, a safe zone, anything, but the facility was vast, and the infection had already spread to places they couldn't even begin to fathom. "Mitchell," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. "We need to make it to the emergency lab. It's not far from here. We might be able to find something to help you there." He glanced at her, his lips cracking into a weak smile. If I don't make it, you have to. You have to stop it. All of it. You can't let it spread any further." Evelyn clenched her jaw, refusing to acknowledge what he was implying. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. "We'll make it," she said firmly, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't so sure anymore. The facility was a maze, and the infection was spreading faster than they could keep up with. Each new scream, each new growl, felt like a reminder of how much they were losing. They came to another junction in the tunnels, an intersection of 3 dark passages. Evelyn paused, scanning the area for any sign of movement. She could feel her heart in her throat. If they took the wrong path, it could lead them straight into more infected, or worse, into something that was waiting. "We take the left," she said decisively, tugging Mitchell along. The tunnel ahead seemed to open into a wider area, perhaps a storage room, and there was a faint flicker of light coming from down the corridor. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was their best shot. But as they moved forward, a distant sound made Evelyn freeze in her tracks. A low, dragging noise, almost like footsteps, mixed with something worse. Something that made her blood run cold. Her hand shot out, grabbing Mitchell's arm and pulling him into a shadowed alcove in the wall. The infected were getting closer. She could hear their growls and the sickening thud of their feet scraping against the stone floor. "Stay quiet," she whispered harshly, her voice low. Her mind raced. There were too many of them, and they were getting closer. If they didn't act fast, they'd be trapped. She pressed her back to the cold stone, feeling her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The infected passed by the alcove, oblivious to their presence. Their twisted forms shuffled forward, dragging their limbs, and Evelyn held her breath, praying they wouldn't notice the small sound of her and Mitchell's ragged breathing. When the sounds of the infected faded into the distance, Evelyn exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice hoarse. "We can't stay here long." Mitchell nodded weakly, his eyes unfocused, but he still managed a small, pained smile. "Lead the way." They moved cautiously, ducking into the next section of the tunnel, the light ahead growing brighter. With every step, Evelyn's stomach churned with a feeling of dread that wouldn't let up. They were getting closer to the emergency lab, but what would they find when they got there? Would there be anything left? They reached the door to the lab, a thick, reinforced metal door. A flickering light shone from the small window above it, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Evelyn's hands shook as she reached for the control panel beside the door. The emergency override should have been active, but as she pressed the button, nothing happened. Damn it, she muttered under her breath, frustration tightening her chest. The infection was everywhere, and now they were running out of time, out of options. Wait, Mitchell's voice was weak, but he was suddenly more alert. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. Try the backup key. In the second drawer. I remember. We used it before. Evelyn's heart skipped. The backup key. She remembered now, of course. She hadn't thought of it in the chaos of their escape, but it was their last hope. She rushed to the nearby desk and yanked open the drawer. Her fingers brushed against a cold metal object, small, like a key card. With a breath of relief, she snatched it up and rushed back to the control panel, inserting the key card into the slot. The door's locks clicked open with a soft whir. It was their only chance. She pushed the door open. The lab beyond was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and sterilized metal. The lab, once a place of order and precision, now felt like a tomb. But as they stepped inside, Evelyn's eyes caught the faint glow of another emergency light, illuminating a long row of cabinets. She moved toward them with determination, pulling open drawers in search of something, anything, that could help. Medicine, vaccines, antidotes. She heard Mitchell's labored breathing behind her. She glanced back at him. His eyes were duller now, the blood loss more apparent as he swayed slightly. Please, he whispered, his voice hoarse. If you can't find anything, don't let it take me. Evelyn's heart twisted, but she didn't have time to dwell on his words. She tore open a final drawer, and then there it was, a small vial of clear liquid. She didn't know what it was, but it was their only shot. She grabbed it and turned to Mitchell. This might be it. Just hold on. We're getting out of here. Mitchell's gaze was glazed with exhaustion, but he nodded weakly, trusting her despite the odds. Evelyn quickly uncapped the vial, scanning the label as best she could under the dim light. It wasn't labeled clearly, but the word antidote was scribbled faintly on a corner. Please, she muttered, as she carefully injected the contents into Mitchell's arm. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the lab was deafening. Evelyn held her breath, watching Mitchell's face intently. She didn't know what this was supposed to do, but it was all they had. Then, slowly, Mitchell's breathing began to steady. His color started to return to his face, just a little, but it was enough to make her heart leap. I think it's working, she whispered, her voice hoarse with hope. But as the door to the lab creaked open with an ominous groan, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. They weren't alone anymore. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs as the door creaked open, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence of the lab. She spun around, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. The vial in her hand was still warm, the liquid inside it barely visible now under the low light. Her first instinct was to grab Mitchell and run, but as she turned, she saw him, his color returning, his breath steadier, but his eyes locked on the doorway. There, in the darkened frame of the open door, stood a figure. Not an infected, but something else, something far more sinister. It was tall, unnaturally so, with a thin, skeletal frame that was draped in tattered remnants of what had once been a lab coat. Its skin, pale and stretched tight over its bones, gleamed faintly under the emergency lighting, and its eyes, wide, dark, and hollow, stared at them with an intensity that sent a chill straight through Evelyn's spine. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them, its head tilted slightly as if it were studying them. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what she was seeing. This wasn't infected. It was something worse. "Oh, what are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a mixture of fear and disbelief. The figure didn't respond, but then it took a slow step forward, its bare feet scraping against the floor in a sound that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Evelyn. Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to snap her out of her frozen state. "We need to move. That thing. It's not like the others." Evelyn didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Mitchell by the arm, pulling him toward the back of the lab. Her mind screamed to her to think, to act, but her body was moving on instinct. They had no time to lose. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just another infected. But just as they reached the back of the lab, the figure spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that sounded like a tortured breath. "Leave. Now." The words sent a jolt of fear through Evelyn's entire body. She had heard it. That wasn't a growl or a scream. It was a warning. Mitchell's legs were wobbling, his breath shallow as he tried to keep up with her. She could see the exhaustion on his face, the color fading again. But he was still moving, still trying to stay with her. They reached the exit door, and Evelyn slammed her hand against the emergency release. The door refused to budge. She slammed it again, but nothing. "It's locked," she muttered, panic rising in her chest. "It's locked. We're trapped." The figure was moving now, its steps slow and deliberate, but each one brought it closer to them, like a nightmare advancing in slow motion. Evelyn turned toward Mitchell, her mind racing for another option. Then, her eyes landed on the control panel near the corner of the room. It wasn't far, but it might as well have been miles away. If she could get to it, there was a chance she could override the door's lock. "Mitchell, stay here," she ordered, though she could hear the tremor in her voice. She hated the words the moment they left her mouth, but there was no choice. "No," he gasped, trying to push himself up. "I'm not leaving you. Just stay low. Stay quiet," she urged, her heart breaking as she looked at him. He was already fading again, but she couldn't help him if she didn't get them out of this room. She turned and sprinted toward the control panel, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the figure moving, its presence looming behind her, but she didn't dare glance back. She focused only on the panel, hoping beyond reason that there was still power, that there was a way out. Her fingers flew across the buttons as she tried to access the system. The blinking lights on the console gave no reassurance, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. With a final push of a button, the screen flickered and the lock on the door released with a soft click. Without wasting a second, she grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. But before they could escape, the figure's voice stopped them in their tracks. "You think you can escape?" it whispered, its voice impossibly cold. Evelyn's breath caught. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, an unnatural presence closing in. Mitchell, still weak but not as bad as before, managed to stagger to his feet. "We don't have time for this," he growled through gritted teeth, pushing past Evelyn. The air in the lab seemed to shift, heavy with the scent of decay. The figure didn't move, it didn't need to. Its eyes seemed to pierce through Evelyn, straight into her soul. She felt the weight of its gaze like an oppressive force pushing down on her chest. "Run," it whispered, and that was enough. Evelyn grabbed Mitchell, dragging him toward the door, pulling him into the hallway, just as the figure let out a low, echoing laugh behind them. They stumbled down the hallway, leaving the lab behind. Evelyn's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder. The corridor was empty, but she knew the figure was still there, lurking in the darkness. They didn't stop, didn't look back. They couldn't. The hallway stretched on before them, an endless series of dark tunnels, but it was their only chance. With Mitchell leaning heavily on her, they ran. They had no idea where they were going, no idea if they would make it out. But one thing was certain, whatever was chasing them, whatever horrors this facility held, would not stop. They had to outrun it. They had to survive. Evelyn's legs burned as she pulled Mitchell through the maze of hallways, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls, but it wasn't the only sound. Behind them, the floor trembled with the low, ominous thud of something large moving, something that could catch them at any moment. The hallway stretched out in front of them, endlessly dark, a labyrinth with no way of knowing which path was safer than the other. They needed to get to the emergency exit or some way out of the facility, but the place was like a tomb. Every turn they made felt like another step deeper into the nightmare. "Mitchell, stay with me," Evelyn urged, her voice tight. She could feel the weight of his body sagging more with each step. He was barely conscious now, leaning heavily on her as they moved. I'm trying," he gasped, his face pale again, blood staining his shirt where the wound in his side had reopened. His breath came in shallow, pained bursts. "You need to leave me. It's not worth it." "Shut up," Evelyn snapped, though the words came out softer than she meant. Her heart ached at the thought of losing him, but they weren't done. Not yet. "We're getting out of here together. Understand?" Mitchell didn't respond, but she could feel him nod slightly against her. She had to believe it. They had to survive this. They reached another junction in the corridor. Evelyn stopped, her chest tightening as she tried to figure out which direction to take. Every path looked the same, cold, dark, endless. She could hear something, a faint shuffling, then a low, disturbing screech, followed by that voice again. The one that had warned them in the lab. "You can't escape." The voice seemed to whisper through the walls, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating in her mind, making her pulse spike. Evelyn gritted her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the rising panic. She couldn't think about that thing now, not when Mitchell was hanging on by a thread. "We're going left," she decided, taking the path that seemed to lead toward the older part of the facility. Maybe it would connect to the maintenance tunnels, maybe there'd be an exit there. She didn't know, but she had to keep moving. They turned down the narrow hallway, which led into a cramped stairwell. The metal steps creaked beneath their weight, but there was no time to be cautious. They had to go up to where they could find a way out. The stairwell was eerily quiet except for the faint sound of their hurried footsteps and Mitchell's ragged breaths. The air was growing colder the higher they went, and Evelyn's skin prickled with the oppressive sense that they were being watched. "Evelyn, stop." Mitchell's voice was weak, almost like he was drifting in and out of consciousness. "I don't know if I can make it." She squeezed his hand tighter, though she could feel the strength leaving his grip. "You don't have a choice. You're going to make it. We're almost there." The words felt hollow, even to her. They weren't almost anywhere. They had no idea where they were going, but she couldn't let fear take over. She couldn't let the darkness swallow them. They reached the top of the stairs and found themselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with dusty pipes, and the air smelled damp and old, like it hadn't been touched in years. Evelyn didn't hesitate, pulling Mitchell down the hallway with determination. The floor was uneven, and their footsteps echoed in the silence. But something about the space made her feel like they weren't alone. A distant sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a low growl like an animal in pain, but distorted somehow. Not the infected, not the thing in the lab. Something else. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing. Still, the sound lingered, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice shaking despite herself. Mitchell didn't answer. She glanced at him. His eyes were barely open now, his face pale, a sheen of sweat coating his skin. He was slipping, his body was giving out faster than she could keep up. The infection was spreading faster than the antidote could fight it, and she could see the signs. His pupils were dilating, his pulse weak and erratic. "Mitchell," she said, almost pleading now. "You need to hang on. I'm not leaving you. Don't give up on me." He tried to smile, though it came out more like a grimace. I don't have much left, but I trust you." Evelyn's heart squeezed painfully. "Then trust me now. We're going to make it." The sound of the growl grew louder, closer, and she turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness at the far end of the hallway. At first, she thought it was an infected, but then her blood ran cold as she saw its silhouette, too tall, too thin, and its movements too deliberate. It was the thing from the lab, the one that had spoken. The figure didn't rush toward them, but it was coming. Slow, almost as if it were savoring the moment. No, Evelyn whispered to herself, her mind racing for an escape. There was nowhere to run. The hallway had no other exits, no other doors. She pulled Mitchell to the side, trying to find cover, but it was futile. The figure was closing in, and with each step it took, the air seemed to grow heavier. Evelyn, Mitchell's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Her heart skipped a beat. No, she wasn't going to let him die. Not here. Not like this. She couldn't let him go. Evelyn's hands trembled, her mind spinning, searching desperately for something, anything, that could save them. There had to be something, some way to fight back. But the only thing she had was the vial of antidote, and it was already in Mitchell's system. She glanced up at the figure, her eyes meeting the dark, hollow gaze. It was watching them, waiting. And then, in a flash of desperation, something inside Evelyn snapped. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out the last thing she had, the emergency flare gun they had found earlier in a maintenance area. Without hesitation, she aimed it at the figure and pulled the trigger. The flare shot through the air, a bright streak of fire, illuminating the figure for a moment in its unnatural glow. But as it reached the figure, there was no explosion, no flash of light or burning destruction. Instead, the figure just stood still, almost as if it were, absorbing it. And then, the screech came, a horrible, unearthly noise that made Evelyn's blood run cold. The figure let out a sound that wasn't just a growl, but something almost human. Evelyn, it's not over, Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible now, his eyes dull. She didn't have time to respond. The figure advanced, and Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet shift. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The infection was not just spreading through the facility. It was alive, and now was coming for them. The figure stepped forward, its limbs bending in unnatural angles as it glided closer to them. The screech echoed through the hallway, vibrating the walls, and Evelyn's body froze with terror. The flare gun had done nothing to stop it, nothing to even phase it. In fact, it almost seemed to make the creature stronger, as if the light from the flare was feeding it, growing its power. Evelyn's mind scrambled for something, anything that could protect them. She glanced at Mitchell, who was barely standing now, his breath shallow, his body trembling. His face had gone even paler, his skin nearly translucent, and his eyes were glazed with fever. The antidote was no miracle. It wasn't enough to fight what they were up against. The infection had spread too far. Mitchell, she breathed, her voice cracking. We need to get out of here. Now. He didn't respond at first, his eyes unfocused. But then, as if hearing her voice through the haze of pain, his lips parted with effort. Evelyn, I can't, he whispered hoarsely, a weak cough following. It's too late for me. You need to. Save yourself. The words cut through her like a knife. She couldn't leave him behind. Not after everything they'd been through. Not when he was the only person left she cared about in this hellish place. No, she said, her voice rising with desperation. We're getting out of here together. You're not dying here, Mitchell. You're not. The figure was closer now, too close. Evelyn could hear the rasp of its breath, the hiss of air through its jagged teeth. She could feel the heat radiating from its twisted form. It was no longer just watching them, it was hunting them. Mitchell's body shuddered again, his head lolling to one side as if his strength was completely gone. His eyes met hers, soft and filled with a sad acceptance. I'm sorry, Evelyn. You've been so strong. I wish. A low growl cut him off, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The creature was right behind them now, and its presence felt like a weight crushing down on her chest. She pulled Mitchell towards the nearest door, hoping beyond reason that it would open. She slammed her palm against the control panel. It flickered once, then died. "Damn it," she shouted, panic surging through her. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. The figure was mere steps away, and she could hear its breath, like wet, tortured whispers in the darkness. With a burst of adrenaline, Evelyn grabbed the edge of the wall and yanked herself around. She needed something, anything. There had to be an escape. And then she saw it. A small maintenance hatch, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tucked behind a row of pipes, hidden from immediate view, but it was their only shot. Evelyn turned to Mitchell, trying to keep him steady, but his legs buckled and he collapsed to the ground, the infection already too far along. His eyes were unfocused, and the life seemed to be draining from him with each passing second. "No!" Evelyn screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, gripping his shoulders. "You have to hold on." But his breathing was shallow, his pulse faint. He barely seemed to register her touch, his eyes unfocused and glazed over with fever. The figure was just behind them now, its shadow stretching over them like a dark omen. Evelyn could feel its gaze searing into her soul. A soft, rasping whisper escaped from the figure's twisted mouth. "Let him go." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She shook Mitchell desperately, but there was no response. Mitchell's lips parted one last time, his voice barely above a breath. "I love you." And then, with one final exhale, he was still. Evelyn's heart shattered her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, but there was no time to mourn, no time to grieve. She could feel the presence of the figure, closing in on her with every second. She could feel its hunger, its thirst for something she didn't understand, but she knew she couldn't let it claim her too. Without thinking, she grabbed the hatch, pulled it open with all her remaining strength, and shoved herself into the dark passage below. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The hatch slammed shut behind her, cutting off the creature's presence from the light. She scrambled down the narrow, damp tunnel, her hands shaking as she moved through the darkness. Her chest heaved with sobs, but she silenced them as best as she could. She had to keep moving. Mitchell was gone, but she wasn't. The tunnel curved, and Evelyn kept pushing forward, running on pure instinct. She didn't know where it led or what lay at the end of it, but it was the only option left. She had to survive. She couldn't die here. Not in this place with that thing following her. The walls of the tunnel closed in tighter, and Evelyn's mind raced with thoughts of escape. She remembered the surface. An old emergency protocol said there was a secondary access point that led to a nearby facility. Maybe, just maybe, it would lead her out, away from this nightmare. But as she rounded the corner, a shadow emerged ahead. Her pulse spiked, and she braced herself for the worst. The thing wasn't far behind her. It was still coming, except the shadow was different. Not the same hunched, unnatural shape. This was another figure, a human form, silhouetted against a faint light in the distance. Evelyn. Her heart leapt in her throat. She froze, blinking through the darkness, trying to make out the face of the figure. "Dr. Kane," she gasped, her voice hoarse. The figure stepped forward, the dim light revealing the familiar features of the scientist she'd worked with months ago. Dr. Kane, the same one who had been part of the team that helped develop the vaccine, the one who had disappeared in the chaos of the outbreak. "You're alive," she whispered, disbelieving. Dr. Kane nodded grimly. "For now, but we need to move fast. They're all over the place, and they're getting smarter." Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. There's something in the lab. Not here, not now. We'll explain everything once we're out," Dr. Kane interrupted. "But we have to move. It's not just infected anymore, Evelyn. The worst is yet to come." The weight of her situation crashed down on her again. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. Evelyn's breath was ragged, her chest heaving with each shallow inhale. She looked at Dr. Kane, still trying to process the fact that someone familiar was standing in front of her after everything that had happened. After Mitchell, after the nightmare lab, the creature, the infection, the way Dr. Kane looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and urgency, was enough to snap her back into focus. "We don't have much time," Dr. Kane said, his voice steady but low. "The tunnel systems are the only way out right now. But it's not just the infected you have to worry about. There are others. People who've changed, become something else. I was with a group of survivors. But now," he trailed off, his gaze flickering to the darkness behind them. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? Who are these people?" Dr. Kane shook his head, glancing around them. "We don't have time for details. Trust me, whatever it is you saw in the lab, it's connected to all of this. The infection's not just spreading anymore. It's evolving." She swallowed hard. "Evolving?" He nodded grimly. "Yes, it's no longer just about the virus turning people into mindless creatures. There are other mutations happening, things that shouldn't exist. Things like that thing from the lab. It's one of many." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Mutations. That thing had been a human once. Had been a test subject gone wrong? Or something far worse? Her mind raced, but she forced herself to focus on what mattered getting out, and finding a way to stop this madness. Dr. Kane turned and began walking down the narrow tunnel, urging her to follow. "We need to reach the secondary access point. It's our best shot." Evelyn hesitated for a moment, looking back at the pitch-black corridor they'd just come from. The sounds of shuffling, growling, and the low creaks of the infected were growing louder though the entire facility was alive with movement. It was like they were being hunted by something far more intelligent than the rabid creatures they'd encountered before. She glanced at Dr. Kane, his face etched with the same exhaustion, fear, and determination she felt. He was their only hope now. She nodded, steeling herself. "Lead the way." As they moved through the tunnel, the air became damp and cold, the walls closing in on them in places where the pipes were thick and almost claustrophobic. The sounds of the creatures grew fainter, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, watching. She had the sense that they were not as alone as they seemed. "So, how did you survive?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the dread creeping in. She needed to know, to understand how Dr. Kane had made it out of the chaos. I don't know," he admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't supposed to be the one who made it out, but I did. The others didn't survive the outbreak. I tried to get the data we needed. I was part of the team to try to stop this, but it got out of control. They were using the virus for something else, something worse." "Something worse," Evelyn repeated, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Dr. Kane stopped for a moment, his eyes darkening with a kind of haunted knowledge. They didn't just want to cure the infected, Evelyn. They were trying to weaponize it. They didn't want to save the world. They wanted to control it. To use the virus to create super soldiers. It's why the mutations are happening now. It's why that thing in the lab exists. It's not just a byproduct of the virus. It's the result of their experiments. Evelyn's blood ran cold as the implications hit her. "So, it was all intentional?" He nodded grimly. "Yes, and now the experiments are out of control. They were trying to create something more, something better. But all they did was create monsters. The kind of monsters that can't be stopped." Evelyn's mind raced, the weight of his words settling over her like a crushing wave. "What do we do now? How do we stop it?" Dr. Kane turned his face to her, eyes filled with grim resolution. "We stop it at the source. The facility's underground labs. There's a containment unit there. It holds the key to everything. If we can destroy it, maybe we can stop this before it spreads any further. But we have to hurry." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She had already lost too much to turn back now. Mitchell, the others, she couldn't let this nightmare keep going. They had to end it. They had to find the heart of the infection and destroy it. The tunnel twisted and turned, but Dr. Kane moved with purpose, and Evelyn followed, her heart racing. The only light came from the faint glow of emergency bulbs, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for them. The silence around them was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and a distant rumble of something moving deep within the walls. Evelyn's mind kept drifting back to Mitchell's face, his words, the way he looked at her one last time. She could still feel the weight of his hand in hers, the warmth of his voice as he told her to survive. She had to. Another few minutes passed, and then Dr. Kane came to a stop in front of a metal door. It was smaller than the ones they had passed earlier, but it looked reinforced. A control panel was embedded in the wall next to it. "This is it," Dr. Kane said, his voice low. "We need to get through this door. It leads to the main facility's lower levels. We'll be able to access the containment unit from there." Evelyn didn't waste a second. She approached the panel and started working on it, her fingers moving quickly over the buttons, her mind focused on the task. It wasn't easy. The control system had been damaged in the chaos, but after a tense moment, she heard the soft click of the door unlocking. Dr. Kane stepped forward, pushing the door open slowly. The hallway beyond it was darker, more desolate, and Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped inside. "Stay close," Dr. Kane whispered. They moved through the hallways, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every step felt heavier, the silence pressing down on her. And then, suddenly, there was a sound, a deep, guttural growl, like a low rumble from the depths of the earth. Evelyn froze. Dr. Kane's face hardened. "They're here." A moment later, the hallway was flooded with movement, figures shuffling, stumbling toward them from the dark, their eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The infected. But these weren't the mindless ones. These were different. These were faster, smarter, and they were closing in. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. There was no turning back now. The infected surged toward them, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the low growls reverberating off the walls as they closed in. These weren't the same mindless creatures they'd faced before. These were evolved, intelligent, with a menacing, predatory grace that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Dr. Kane's eyes locked onto the oncoming horde, and in that instant, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device, a remote detonator. He glanced at Evelyn, his expression tight. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice barely audible over the shuffling of the infected. "We can't outrun them, but if we're lucky, we can buy ourselves a few minutes." He pressed a button on the device, and a distant explosion echoed through the facility. The ground trembled beneath them, dust falling from the ceiling as the force of the blast sent a wave of heat down the hall. The infected momentarily recoiled, disoriented, but they quickly regained their composure, their focus sharpening. "They're not just after us," Dr. Kane muttered, watching the creatures. "They're programmed to find and eliminate anyone they deem a threat. If we don't get to the containment unit soon, they'll catch us." Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she glanced around, trying to assess the situation. The tunnel ahead of them was narrowing, the walls closing in on them from both sides. She could feel the infected getting closer, their growls almost deafening now. "What's the plan?" she asked urgently. Dr. Kane's jaw clenched. "We have two choices. We can try to fight them off, but that's a losing battle. Or we can keep moving. If we can reach the containment unit before they swarm us, we might be able to destroy the heart of the infection." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Let's move." They bolted down the narrow hallway, Evelyn's heart pounding in her throat. Every footstep felt like a countdown, the infected closing in with terrifying speed. She could hear them, feel them. Right behind her, their distorted growls like a death sentence hanging in the air. She glanced at Dr. Kane, who was leading the way with grim determination. He didn't look back, but the desperation in his eyes was clear. He knew how close they were to death, how fragile their chances were. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in tighter as they pushed forward. But then, ahead, there was a faint light, flickering, weak, but still a beacon of hope. The containment unit. Almost there, Dr. Kane shouted, his voice strained. Evelyn's pulse quickened as they reached the entrance. The door was a heavy steel barrier, reinforced and locked, but the control panel beside it was smashed, wires exposed and sparking intermittently. "Get it open," Evelyn urged, her voice hoarse with panic. Dr. Kane slammed his hand against the control panel, his fingers working feverishly as he tried to hack into the system. The sounds of the infected were getting louder, closer. Evelyn could feel the heat of their breath on her neck. "We don't have time," she yelled, panic rising her chest. "I know," Dr. Kane snapped. His hands flew over the panel, his face twisted in concentration. The door creaked as something large slammed against it from the other side, and Evelyn's stomach lurched. They were too close. Too damn close. Come on," Dr. Kane muttered, and with one final push, the door unlocked with a sharp clunk. The door slowly swung open, and Evelyn didn't wait another second. She rushed inside, Dr. Kane right behind her, and the door slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud. They were inside. The room was a sterile, cold environment, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and something else, something darker. The flickering lights cast an eerie glow on rows of containment chambers, their glass panels cracked or shattered, revealing the twisted remains of whatever had been inside. Some were empty, others were not. But in the center of the room, there was a large containment unit, something different. More advanced, more secure, and it hummed with an unnatural energy. "That's it," Dr. Kane said, his voice hoarse. "That's the heart of it all. The original virus strain, the one they were trying to weaponize." Evelyn moved toward it, her mind racing. If they could destroy this, maybe, just maybe, they could stop everything. She reached for the device on her belt, the emergency detonator they'd been given for situations like this. It was their last shot, but as her fingers brushed the detonator, she froze. Behind them, the door shook violently. Dr. Kane turned, his eyes widening in realization. They've breached the door. We don't have much time. Evelyn's heart dropped. The infected were coming. Fast. She could hear them, their guttural screams and snarls rattling the door, pounding against it like a relentless tide. She glanced at the containment unit. There was no time to set up the device properly. No time to plan. "We have to destroy it," Dr. Kane said, his voice almost desperate. "It's the only way." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She hit the emergency button on the detonator, and the ground beneath them shook violently. A loud, deafening roar filled the room, and the containment unit began to pulse with a terrible, unnatural force. The air in the room seemed to crackle with energy. "No!" Dr. Kane shouted. "It's not supposed to be this way. If we don't shut it down now, it'll..." Before he could finish, the unit exploded. The force of the blast sent them both flying across the room, slamming into the walls with bone-shattering force. Evelyn's vision went black for a moment as the world spun around her, but she could still hear the screeching of the infected. The explosion had caused a chain reaction, sending shockwaves through the facility. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, her head spinning, her body aching. She could hear Dr. Kane groaning beside her, and she quickly turned to help him up. "We need to move. Now," she said, her voice hoarse, her every instinct screaming at her to run. But as they moved toward the door, Evelyn saw something that made her blood run cold. Through the shattered glass of the containment unit, a figure was emerging, tall, thin, its limbs twisted and elongated, covered in dark, pulsating veins. It was alive, and it was coming for them. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the monstrous figure began to pull itself free from the remnants of the containment unit. It was like something straight out of a nightmare. Its skin was stretched tight, translucent in places, revealing dark, pulsating veins. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, and its fingers curled like claws, each movement deliberate, predatory. The room was still vibrating from the explosion, debris scattered everywhere, but there was no time to recover. The creature was already moving toward them, its body twisting and contorting with a disturbing fluidity that no human could manage. Evelyn barely had time to react before Dr. Kane grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the creature's path. "Move!" he shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. His grip tightened on her wrist as he dragged her toward the door. She didn't argue. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she followed him, her legs like lead as they ran through the maze of shattered glass and twisted metal. The floor beneath them was slick with blood. There was no telling how many experiments had gone horribly wrong in this place. But as they rounded the corner toward the exit, Evelyn's eyes fell on the shattered door leading to the hallway outside. It had been breached. The infected were already pouring through. "We can't go that way," she screamed, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the creatures behind them. Dr. Kane cursed under his breath. "The only way out is through the vents. We'll have to climb up to the next level." He pushed open a nearby access hatch and scrambled inside, pulling Evelyn up after him. She had no choice but to follow. There was nothing left but to climb. Her heart was in her throat as she slid into the darkened vent system, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. Dr. Kane moved swiftly, his face a mask of concentration as he led the way. She could hear the infected in the distance, their growls and shrieks growing louder as they flooded the facility. They were closing in. Time was running out. "Where does this lead?" Evelyn asked between labored breaths as she crawled through the narrow ducts, the air stale and thick with the scent of metal and dust. "The upper levels," Dr. Kane replied, his voice low. "The secondary evacuation route should be up ahead." Evelyn nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. There had been so many false promises in this nightmare, so many twists and turns that had led her nowhere. But right now, it was the only hope they had. The creature, the infected, they were all relentless, and the blast from the containment unit had only made everything worse. They reached a vertical shaft with a ladder leading up to another level. Dr. Kane went first, his movements quick and sure, but Evelyn's hands were trembling as she gripped the rungs. It felt like the walls were closing in on her again, the darkness pressing from all sides. As she climbed, a sound that made her blood freeze ran through the ducts. A scraping, dragging sound. Slowly but steadily, it grew louder, echoing in the narrow space. Her heart leaped in her throat. "Dr. Kane," she whispered, her voice shaking, "they're here." He froze halfway up the ladder, his head turning toward her. His eyes widened in realization. "We need to hurry. Now." Evelyn's mind raced. The infected were already in the vent system. It was only a matter of time before they found their way to the ladder, their sharp claws tearing through the metal with ease. She pushed herself harder, her fingers aching as she reached for the next rung. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, she reached the top of the shaft, pulling herself up and out of the vent. She scrambled onto the floor, glancing around the darkened room. This level was different. It was quieter. The air smelled fresher, less stale, but it also felt like a trap. There was something off about it. "Where do we go now?" she asked, catching her breath. Dr. Kane was already moving, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. He pointed to a door at the far end of the room. "Through there. We'll find the access point to the surface." Evelyn didn't question him. She followed, her eyes darting nervously over the shadows. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger with every step. The door wasn't locked, but as Dr. Kane pushed it open, they were met with an unexpected sight. The room beyond was empty, and yet there was an unmistakable sense of foreboding. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something worse than they'd already encountered. Dr. Kane hesitated at the threshold, his gaze flicking toward a set of control panels on the far wall. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. But before Evelyn could respond, the lights above them flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness. A loud bang echoed from behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping metal. Evelyn's heart raced as she spun around, eyes wide, but she couldn't see a thing. "Dr. Kane," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Stay close," came his voice, low and strained. She felt him grab her arm, pulling her toward him. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, as if something was pressing in on them from all sides. And then the sound. A low, vibrating hum. The ground beneath them seemed to shift. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized what was happening. The floor was moving. Before she could react, the walls of the room began to slide open, revealing a hidden passageway, a new path, but not one that led to safety. The sound of the scraping metal grew louder, almost deafening. "No," Dr. Kane's voice faltered. "It's a trap. The entire facility is..." But his words were cut off as a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, elongated, and familiar. The same creature that had emerged from the containment unit, only now it was different. It was no longer a single entity. There were more of them, emerging from hidden corners, their glowing eyes fixated on them. Evelyn's breath quickened as the creatures moved toward them with predatory grace. These are no longer mindless infected. These are something far worse. Dr. Kane's voice trembled. The virus. It's evolving again. They've adapted. The creature's claws scraped the floor as they advanced. There was no escape. And then the ground beneath them rumbled once more, this time more violently. The entire facility was coming apart at the seams. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the walls and rattling the floor beneath their feet. Evelyn stumbled, her heart pounding in her chest as the creatures, no longer just infected, but something far more monstrous, closed in around them. Their eyes glowed like molten lava, their twisted limbs moving with terrifying precision. She glanced at Dr. Kane, who was gripping a metal rod in his hand. His knuckles were white from the pressure, his face a mask of determination and fear. He seemed to be scanning the room for an escape route, but the walls were closing in. The creatures were everywhere now, their movements too fast, too precise. There was no safe place left to run. "Dr. Kane," Evelyn breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't fight them all. There's too many." He didn't answer right away, his eyes flicking to the ceiling and then to the passageway in the back of the room. It was a small, narrow vent shaft that led deeper into the facility, a possible escape. But the creatures weren't giving them a moment's rest. Their growls echoed in the confined space, making Evelyn's blood run cold. They were fast, relentless. They had them cornered. The ground shook again. The facility was literally falling apart, crumbling under the strain of whatever they had unleashed. "We have to move now," Dr. Kane said, his voice gruff, full of urgency. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the vent shaft at the back of the room. "This way, if we can get into the central core, we might still have a chance to stop this madness." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She allowed herself to be pulled along, her breath ragged, but a flicker of hope igniting inside her. The creatures were closing in, but they had one final chance. This was it. They couldn't let it slip away. As they reached the vent shaft, Dr. Kane scrambled up first, his movements frantic. He looked back at Evelyn, his face lit by the dim, flickering emergency lights overhead. "Hurry," he urged. Evelyn had no time to waste. She grabbed the edges of a shaft and hauled herself up, the metal edges digging into her palms as she climbed. She could hear the creatures growling. Behind them, their feet scraping against the floor, echoing in the dark. They were getting closer. Every step felt like it might be their last. With a final, desperate push, Evelyn pulled herself into the vent, her heart in her throat as she crawled through the narrow, claustrophobic space. Dr. Kane was ahead of her, moving fast, his breath ragged. The sounds of the infected grew fainter as they moved deeper into the ventilation system, but Evelyn could still feel the threat behind them, like a shadow creeping ever closer. "Where are we going?" she gasped. her voice echoing in the tight space. "To the control room," Dr. Kane replied, his tone grim. "It's the only place left that might have the power to shut this all down." Evelyn's mind raced as she followed him, her arms and legs aching from the effort of crawling. The facility was deteriorating around them. She could feel the vibrations, hear the creaks of the metal walls as they moved through the air ducts. It was like the entire structure was alive and fighting against them, trying to swallow them whole. "Do you have any idea how to stop this?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fear rising in her chest again. Dr. Kane didn't answer at first. His movements slowed for a fraction of a second, and Evelyn could feel the weight of his silence. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost regretful. "I don't know, but we don't have another choice." The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed from behind them. Evelyn froze. The infected had found their way into the ducts. "They're here," she hissed, panic crawling up her spine. Dr. Kane's eyes flickered with alarm. Without hesitation, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small, cylindrical device. It was a detonator similar to the one they had used before, but this one had something different about it. Something more advanced. "We don't have much time," he said. "This is a failsafe. We can trigger an EMP blast to disrupt the entire facility's systems, including the infected. It should buy us enough time to reach the control room." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "EMP? That's going to take down everything. The whole place will go dark." Dr. Kane nodded. "Exactly. We'll have a window of maybe 10 minutes. That's all we need. We just need to reach the control room before they catch us." The sound of claws scraping against the metal walls grew louder. They were getting closer. Every second counted. Evelyn didn't waste another breath. She followed Dr. Kane as they continued to crawl through the vents, their bodies moving with a desperation that matched the urgency of the situation. The vibrations beneath them were becoming stronger, more intense, as the building continued to collapse around them. Finally, they reached the end of the vent shaft, a small access panel on the floor below. Dr. Kane slammed his fist against it, and the panel slid open with a loud metallic clunk. They dropped down into a large, open room, the control room. The space was illuminated by the soft glow of red emergency lights, the floor scattered with overturned equipment, flickering screens, and broken terminals. The hum of the facility's power grid was faint, like the last breath of a dying animal. And in the corner of the room, there was a large central console, the heart of the facility's control systems. Dr. Kane rushed toward it, his fingers flying over the keys as he input commands with practiced precision. Evelyn stood beside him, her breath heavy as she scanned the room. The infected were still out there, but the EMP had given them a brief respite. They were temporarily blind, disoriented. But for how long? "I'm in," Dr. Kane said, his voice tight. He paused for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "This is it. If we do this right, we can trigger the shutdown sequence and neutralize the virus. We can stop the spread." Evelyn's gaze flicked to the screen, her eyes wide as she saw the readouts. A countdown had started. It was their last chance. "Do it," she urged, her voice trembling. "Hurry." But just as Dr. Kane was about to hit the final command, the doors to the control room slammed open with a deafening crash. The infected, and this time they were not alone. The sound of the door crashing open was deafening, sending a rush of cold fear through Evelyn's veins. She spun toward the entrance, heart pounding as the infected flooded into the control room, their glowing eyes locked on her and Dr. Kane with a predatory hunger. But there was something worse. Behind the first wave of infected, a towering figure stepped into the room. It was the same creature they had seen earlier, the one that had emerged from the containment unit. But now it was more than a nightmare. It was their nightmare. It had grown, evolved, its form twisted and elongated. Its skin was now a sickly, translucent gray, and its eyes blazed with an unnatural, malignant intelligence. The creature's mouth stretched open in an eerie, chilling, serrated teeth. Its elongated fingers twitched, claws scraping against the floor as it stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "It's the original subject," Dr. Kane gasped, his voice strained. "The virus. It evolved, and now it's something worse. It's aware." He was still standing at the control panel, his fingers frozen over the keys. Evelyn could see the terror in his eyes, the realization that this was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight against something that had transcended all logic and reason. A creature that could think, could plan. The creature's eyes flicked to Dr. Kane, and it tilted its head, a predatory smile spreading across its face. Then it let out a guttural, inhuman growl. The infected surged forward, moving like a tidal wave toward the two of them. But the creature held them back with a single, commanding gesture. The infected halted, their bodies trembling as if they were awaiting its orders. "Why isn't it attacking?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible, her heart racing as she backed up toward Dr. Kane. "It's using them. They're part of its swarm now. It's controlling them, directing them." Evelyn's mind reeled. "We're trapped." The creature's eyes flicked back toward her, and for a brief moment, she could have sworn it was studying her, almost calculating. It didn't make any move to approach just yet, instead staying at the back of the room, the infected waiting at its command. There was something more deliberate about its actions, something intelligent. Dr. Kane cursed, backing away from the console. "The shutdown protocol won't be enough," he muttered under his breath. "Not with it in control. The virus is too far evolved. If I don't override the entire system manually." Evelyn's heart dropped. "Manually? What do you mean?" "The fail-safes, they're not enough. But I know how to shut it down. I just need time. It's risky, but it's the only way." The creature snarled, snapping Evelyn's attention back to it. It took a step forward, its twisted limbs making the faintest sound as it dragged its claws across the floor. Then, with an almost casual flick of its wrist, it sent the infected charging forward. "No!" Dr. Kane shouted, backing toward her. "I can't finish the sequence without total access to the mainframe. We need to stop it long enough to get to the override panel." Evelyn glanced around the room in panic. The control room was a mess of overturned furniture and shattered equipment, but there had to be something they could use. She spotted a metal pipe lying near the doorway and grabbed it, feeling its cold weight in her hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. The creature and its horde were nearly upon them. "We can't hold them off forever," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "What's the plan?" Dr. Kane was already rushing toward a nearby console. "We don't have a choice. I'll buy us some time. You need to distract them long enough for me to access the override." Evelyn barely had time to process the words before the first infected lunged toward her. She swung the pipe, connecting with the creature's skull with a sickening crack. The infected recoiled, but didn't fall. Its decayed body was too resilient. The infected didn't hesitate. They kept coming. Dr. Kane was furiously typing commands into the control panel, but the creature had begun to move toward him. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes locked on him with an almost eerie focus. It knew he was the key to stopping it. "Don't let it get to me," Dr. Kane shouted, his voice strained. Evelyn swung the pipe again, this time connecting with another infected's head. It staggered back, but more were coming. More were always coming. The ground shook beneath them again. The facility was collapsing around them, but the infected and the creature weren't stopping. They kept moving forward, as if driven by some collective will. "Evelyn now," Dr. Kane shouted. She looked at him, panic tightening her chest. She knew what he was asking. She had to keep the creatures off him, buy him time to finish what he'd started. With a shaky breath, Evelyn swung the pipe with all her strength, connecting with the nearest infected. It fell to the ground with a sickening thud, but there was no time to celebrate. The creatures were relentless, and the air was thick with the sound of their growls, their claws scraping against the floor. But then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something. The creature, the one that had been commanding the horde, was standing just outside the fray. It wasn't attacking yet. It was waiting, watching. It's testing us, Evelyn realized. It's seeing how long we can survive. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced at Dr. Kane. He was still at the console, his fingers flying over the keys. The countdown had started again, and she knew they had only moments before everything would be lost. The infected were closing in on her. She swung the pipe again, knocking one of them back, but it only took a second for another to replace it. Her arms were aching, her legs trembling from the effort, but she couldn't stop. She had to hold them off. Just a little longer, Dr. Kane urged. Almost have it. And then, finally, the creature moved. It was faster than she had ever expected. In a blur of motion, it lunged at Dr. Kane, its claws slashing through the air, aiming straight for his throat. No! Evelyn screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. Without thinking, she threw herself toward him, swinging the pipe with every ounce of strength she had left. She connected with the creature's side, but it barely flinched. The pipe bounced off its thick, mutated hide, but it had been enough to momentarily divert its attention. Go! Evelyn shouted at Dr. Kane. Finish it! With a final, desperate motion, Dr. Kane slammed his fist onto the control panel. The room plunged into chaos. The walls trembled as the entire facility began to shut down. The infected, now suddenly cut off from their source of control, froze for a split second, as if confused. But it was enough. In that moment, Evelyn felt the world shift. She felt the air grow heavier, the darkness thickening as the system began to collapse. And then, silence. The silence that fell over the control room was suffocating. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath ragged as she watched the infected pause, their bodies suddenly still, as if they too were awaiting their fate. The once lurking terror in the room felt like it had been suspended in time. But the silence was only momentary. A sudden, violent shudder ran through the building, a deep, grinding noise as the facility's systems shut down. Lights flickered, and the hum of machinery ceased altogether, leaving a hollow quiet. The infected were still, but the creature, the one that had been commanding them, was far from done. It didn't move, but its eyes locked on Evelyn and Dr. Kane with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Dr. Kane didn't waste a second. The EMP. It worked, he said, his voice shaky but determined. The system is down. The override worked. Evelyn's chest heaved as she caught her breath, her hands shaking with adrenaline. The creature's eyes never left them. There was a brief moment of hope, but she knew better than to believe that the danger was over. It wasn't just the infected they had to worry about now. It was this thing, this creature that was no longer merely part of the infected swarm, but something else entirely. Something intelligent. Something far worse. The creature's lips parted, revealing those jagged, razor-sharp teeth. It didn't attack. It watched them, like a predator playing with its prey, savoring the final moments. "What now?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. She had no idea what more they could do. The facility was collapsing, and the threat still loomed before them, relentless. "We need to destroy it," Dr. Kane said, his voice resolute. "The virus, it's gone beyond what we can contain. If we don't stop it here, it'll spread beyond this facility. It's already adapting. We need to find the core and shut it down for good." Evelyn nodded grimly, knowing what had to be done, but her thoughts were still clouded by the terror of the creature before them. How could they stop something so powerful? How could they destroy it when it was clearly evolving beyond anything they had seen before? As if the creature could hear her thoughts, it finally moved. The air grew thick with its presence, as if the very atmosphere bent around it. It took a step forward, its long, twisted limbs moving with a disturbing grace. And then, the creature spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the walls of the control room. You cannot stop it. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The creature. It could speak. We've already won. The creature continued, its voice growing clearer, though still distorted. You don't even understand the true nature of what you've unleashed. This is just the beginning. The virus is a tool. It was always a tool. Dr. Kane's face paled. No. Evelyn could feel the weight of the creature's words settling over her like a cold, suffocating fog. What do you mean? You're saying it wasn't just a virus? The creature's grin stretched impossibly wide, its twisted, jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. The virus is the key to unlocking the next stage. You've given it everything it needed to evolve: intelligence, power, the means to survive. It's no longer a plague. It's a new species. And you've already set it free. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Evelyn could feel her skin crawling as the walls trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the building. It was them, the infected. They were reacting to the creature's words. Dr. Kane was shaking his head in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. We didn't know it would. Turn like this. You didn't know. The creature spat, its eyes flashing. But it's too late. It's already begun. Evelyn's mind raced. What would they do now? The creature was right. Everything they had tried to contain had broken free. The infected, the virus, the creature itself. It was all interconnected. And it wasn't just a virus anymore. It had become something far more dangerous. We have to end this, she said, her voice hardening with determination. We have to stop it. Now. Dr. Kane nodded, but he was already moving toward the central control panel again. His hands were trembling as he entered the final override sequence. Wait, Evelyn shouted. What if it's too late? What if the whole place is rigged to release? It's not too late, Dr. Kane said, his voice tight with urgency. We can still destroy the core, shut everything down before it can escape. But the creature wasn't done. It lunged at them with a speed Evelyn didn't think was possible. Its claws slashed through the air, and Dr. Kane barely managed to dive out of the way. The infected had begun to stir, their movements jerky and slow at first, but gaining momentum as the creature guided them with a simple flick of its wrist. Evelyn swung the pipe again, desperate to keep the infected at bay, but the creature ignored her entirely. It had its eyes locked on Dr. Kane, who was scrambling to finish his sequence. You think you can stop this? The creature hissed, its voice dripping with malice. I am the future. I am evolution. The walls trembled again, this time violently. A low, rumbling roar seemed to echo from deep within the facility, as if the building itself were groaning under the weight of its twisted creation. We're running out of time, Dr. Kane muttered under his breath. His fingers flew over the control panel again, but the room was becoming more unstable. It's now or never. Suddenly, the power flickered, and the entire facility groaned, sending shockwaves through the ground. The central console blinked and dimmed, and the emergency lights began to strobe erratically. The countdown for the core's shutdown had started again, but it wasn't enough. The creature's influence was already warping everything, trying to push past the systems and regain control. Dr. Kane looked up, his face stricken with dread. It's trying to override the fail-safes. We need to destroy the core before it can. Evelyn's stomach twisted with fear. The creature wasn't going to stop. It was too powerful, too cunning, and she had only one chance to make sure it didn't win. The room shook violently, and Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest. The infected had begun to move again, but this time, they were not as mindless as before. They were following the creature's lead, advancing with eerie coordination, like a pack of animals on the hunt. The creature itself, still standing just beyond the swarm, had its eyes fixed firmly on Dr. Kane. It knew what he was doing. It was trying to stop him. Dr. Kane slammed his fist against the control panel in frustration. It's no use. The core is too deep. If I can't override the shutdown sequence. The creature's voice rang out again, cutting through the chaos like a blade. You don't understand. You never did. You cannot stop it. The virus is not a mistake. It's a key to the next stage of evolution. Evelyn was shaking, her breath shallow, her body trembling from the strain of the fight, the fear, the uncertainty. But she couldn't let it end like this. Not when they were so close. "No," she said, gritting her teeth. "You're lying. We can end this." The creature tilted its head, studying her with a look of such cold calculation that Evelyn's blood ran cold. "End it? You think you can stop something that's already become a part of the very fabric of life? This isn't a virus anymore. It's something more. It's control. It's destiny. And it will spread even if you destroy this place. It's too late to stop the change." Evelyn didn't have time to argue. The infected were getting closer, their eyes locked on her, their movements becoming faster, more aggressive. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Evelyn's mind raced for something, anything, that could tip the balance. Her eyes fell on the small cylindrical device Dr. Kane had used earlier, the EMP device. "Wait," she muttered, barely aware of her own voice. "The EMP. We can use it. We can trigger a final shutdown." Dr. Kane's eyes snapped to her, his expression momentarily flickering with hope. It might not work. The creature, it's already adapted. Its systems might have adapted as well. "Just do it," Evelyn snapped, cutting him off. "We have no choice. We need to disable everything now." Dr. Kane hesitated, then nodded. With quick movements, he yanked the EMP from his pack and pressed a button on its side. The device hummed to life, a low, vibrating whine that grew louder by the second. The creature snarled, its eyes flashing with rage. It turned toward Dr. Kane, its claws flexing as it advanced. It knew what was happening, but it was too late. The EMP released with a sharp pulse. The entire room seemed to tremble with its force, and Evelyn felt a cold, numbing sensation sweep over her. All the lights went out in a flash of white-blue light, and for a moment, everything was submerged in darkness. Then, nothing. The facility went completely silent, its power cut off by the EMP's pulse. The infected halted in their tracks, their eyes losing their eerie glow as the creature's influence over them dissipated. The room was plunged into an eerie, oppressive silence. Evelyn staggered, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she couldn't feel the terror of the infected anymore. They were motionless, their bodies now just shells of the horrors they had once been. Dr. Kane stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. He approached the central console, tapping at the buttons as the facility continued to groan under its own weight. The emergency lights flickered, barely casting a pale light across the room. Evelyn kept her distance, but her eyes were locked on the creature, the thing that had nearly destroyed them all. It stood there, motionless, like a ghost, its eyes still burning with malevolent intelligence. Dr. Kane glanced back at her, his face pale but determined. "The shutdown sequence is complete. The core is down. We did it." For a moment, Evelyn felt the weight of that statement, but then something in the creature's expression changed. It shifted from anger to something darker, something more desperate. "You think you've won?" the creature rasped, its voice dripping with malice. "This place, it's just a cage. The virus is no longer contained. You cannot destroy what has already been awakened. It will live on, in ways you cannot imagine." Evelyn's stomach twisted as she realized the gravity of its words. The creature was right. The virus might be neutralized here, in this facility, but it had already learned. It had already evolved. The creature's eyes flickered, and Evelyn's blood ran cold as it began to shift, its form contorting and warping. It wasn't just a being anymore. It was a force, a presence that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. She felt it, the virus, the intelligence, the horror. It was everywhere now. The creature's very essence was entwined with the building, the air, the ground beneath her feet. "We're too late," Dr. Kane whispered, his voice hollow with realization. "The creature, it's fused with the systems. It's becoming part of everything. Evelyn's eyes widened in horror as the control room's systems flickered back to life. Screens began to pulse with unnatural energy, showing data, readouts, charts, and glowing numbers that made no sense. The facility's structure groaned louder now, like something ancient awakening from a deep slumber. And then it spoke again. You have only delayed the inevitable. The future is already written. The creature's body dissolved into the air, its essence scattering like dust, merging with the very fabric of the world around them. Suddenly, the walls buckled, the ceiling cracking, as the facility began to collapse in on itself. Evelyn and Dr. Kane scrambled, barely making it out of the control room as debris fell behind them. They ran down the corridors, but the building was falling apart faster than they could move. The floor was shaking violently, the walls cracking. There was no escape. The only thing they could do was run and hope they could survive long enough to find a way out. But Evelyn knew the truth now. The creature, the virus, was not gone. It had spread. It had evolved beyond the containment of this facility, beyond anything they could have imagined. And somewhere out there, it was waiting. The chaos of the collapsing facility was deafening. The walls cracked and groaned as the building itself seemed to recoil from the terror it had harbored. Evelyn and Dr. Kane stumbled through the dark corridors, their breath ragged, their bodies exhausted, and their minds overwhelmed by what had just transpired. They ran blindly, not knowing where to go, just knowing they had to get out, away from the epicenter of the horror, away from the nightmare that had begun here. The ground beneath them shuddered, and a loud, rumbling sound echoed through the hallways as if the building itself were screaming in pain. Behind them, there was an explosion of debris as part of the ceiling collapsed, sending a shower of concrete and metal raining down just inches from their heels. "Keep moving," Evelyn shouted, adrenaline pushing her legs faster. "We can't stop now." They rounded a corner, running into a large open space that once might have been a common area. But now, it was a death trap filled with flickering emergency lights and the unsettling sound of the building's failing infrastructure. Evelyn's mind raced as they continued forward, the weight of their situation crashing down on her. The creature isn't dead. It's not contained. The realization gnawed at her, gnawing at her sanity. They reached a door marked exit, but as Dr. Kane grabbed the handle, the door refused to budge. He slammed his shoulder against it, cursing under his breath. The power must have been cut off, or maybe the door had been sealed for some other reason. "We're running out of time," Dr. Kane shouted. "The whole place is coming down." Evelyn spun around, looking for another way out. There was a narrow hallway off to the side, lined with utility doors. It led toward the facility's underground evacuation tunnel, the one they'd used when entering earlier. But she could feel it, the creature's presence, the virus. It wasn't just something inside the walls. It was inside her, inside them. The air was thicker now, suffocating. It was as if the very atmosphere had become a part of the creature's will, a prison for everyone within. They ran toward the tunnel entrance. Behind them, the sound of groaning metal was growing louder, and with a horrifying crack, a section of the ceiling above them collapsed, filling the hallway with a cloud of dust and debris. Evelyn coughed, barely able to see, but she could feel the heavy weight of something shifting just out of sight, something that wasn't entirely human, but a twisted mix of human and something worse. Dr. Kane grabbed her arm, pulling her into the tunnel. The narrow space offered little comfort, but at least it was a semblance of safety, a brief moment of distance from the chaos above. The tunnel was lit by faint emergency lighting, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The echo of their footsteps reverberated through the cold, damp space. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the oppressive silence. Dr. Kane paused, his face grim. "I hear it. It's coming from everywhere." Evelyn turned sharply, a chill creeping down her spine. The tunnel behind them seemed to pulse, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing. "No," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "It can't be here." But it was. The creature, the virus, it was in everything. It was in the air and the walls. It had spread beyond the confines of the building, beyond anything they had ever feared. The walls shuddered again. Then, with a horrifying crack, the concrete at the end of the tunnel began to bulge outward. Something was pushing from the other side. Something massive. Something alive. "We have to move now," Dr. Kane yelled, pulling her further down the tunnel. But Evelyn's feet felt like lead, her mind racing as the realization settled in. They hadn't just unleashed a virus. They had awakened something else. The tunnel began to tremble violently, the ground shaking beneath them. The walls cracked again, and then, with a deafening roar, the ground gave way. Evelyn screamed as the floor beneath them collapsed, sending both her and Dr. Kane tumbling into an abyss of darkness. The world went black. Evelyn's head throbbed as she regained consciousness. Her body was bruised, aching, and disoriented. She could barely make out the dim shapes around her, but the musty, damp air told her she was deep underground. She slowly pushed herself up, blinking against the pain in her skull, and noticed Dr. Kane lying next to her, groaning as he regained his bearings. "Dr. Kane," she whispered, but there was no reply. His eyes fluttered open, and he groaned in pain. "We're alive," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we're not out of it yet." Evelyn stood shakily, her legs weak beneath her. She could feel the tremors beneath her feet, like the ground itself was in a constant state of unrest. She turned around, her eyes widening as she realized where they were. The tunnel had opened into a massive underground cavern. The walls were lined with strange, bioluminescent veins, glowing with an otherworldly light. The floor was covered in strange, organic growths, twisting, writhing things that pulsated as if they were alive. And then there was the sound, a low, vibrating hum that resonated through her very bones. This is it," Dr. Kane muttered, his voice filled with a mix of awe and terror. This was the true purpose of the facility, the core, the research. It was never about containment. It was about evolution. We've opened the door to something beyond us. We've opened the door to the future. Evelyn's stomach twisted in horror. The virus, the creature, they were only the beginning. Out in the distance, she could see something moving, a massive, shifting mass, something alive, something growing. "We can't stop it now," Evelyn said softly, her voice hollow. "It's everywhere." Dr. Kane turned to her, his face a mask of dread. "It's not just here. It's already spreading, if we don't stop it." But before he could finish his thought, there was a sickening screech, and the ground beneath them buckled again. They looked up, and Evelyn's blood turned to ice. The creature, no longer just a single entity, but a presence, an essence, loomed over them, its form shifting and writhing in the shadows, its glowing eyes locking onto theirs. It had followed them, and this time there was no escape. The creature's presence in the cavern was overwhelming. It loomed above them, shifting and warping as though it were not bound by the rules of reality. Evelyn could feel it, its power, its hunger, pressing down on her, as though the very air itself was thick with its dark energy. Every inch of the cavern seemed to vibrate with its essence. Dr. Kane stumbled backward, his face twisted in fear and disbelief. We have to get out of here. If we don't," but the words caught in his throat. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. They both knew there was no escape. Evelyn tried to steady her breath, her mind spinning. The creature had evolved beyond anything they had ever imagined. It wasn't just a virus. It was something alive, something ancient and relentless. It had adapted, taken on new forms, and now it was alive in ways they hadn't even realized. The ground trembled again. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse in rhythm with the creature, as if the very earth beneath them had become an extension of its will. The bioluminescent veins along the walls flickered with light, casting eerie shadows. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through their very bones, a language that Evelyn could barely comprehend, yet somehow understood. You think you can stop it? The creature's voice wasn't a question, it was a statement. It dripped with malice, with arrogance. You have already failed. The virus is no longer contained. It is no longer a thing. It is part of everything. Evelyn's heart raced. She could feel the truth of its words, even if she didn't fully understand them. The creature, no, the virus, had transcended the limits of the facility. It was more than just a biological entity now. It was everywhere. The cavern seemed to close in on them, the walls tightening as if the earth itself was constricting around them. And Evelyn could hear the whispers, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder. They were not human voices, but something else, something inhuman, a chorus of voices, like an army of lost souls all calling out in unison. Dr. Kane, Evelyn whispered, fear lacing her voice. What if it's already taken over everything? What if there's no way to stop it? His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw the terror in them. The hopelessness. It's too late. We created something that can't be undone. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The creature had won. There was no containment. There was no escape. But before Evelyn could process it, the creature's form began to shift again, its outline distorting as though it were made of shadows and smoke. It moved forward slowly, its movements graceful, predatory. The shadows stretched and twisted, reaching toward them. And then it spoke again. You will be the first of many to understand, to become. This world will bow to me. The ground beneath their feet rumbled violently, and Evelyn's stomach twisted in horror. The air was thick with the sense of inevitability, like something massive was about to break free from the bowels of the earth. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the cavern. Dr. Kane spun around, his eyes wide with realization. No, it's activating the core. It's trying to spread faster than we can stop it. Evelyn felt a deep sense of dread as she watched the walls shimmer and warp, the very fabric of reality seeming to bend in on itself. It wasn't just a physical thing anymore. It was something much more dangerous. The virus was becoming part of the world, part of everything. We have to stop it, Evelyn said, her voice steadying with resolve. We have no other choice. But as soon as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. How could they stop something like this? How could they fight it when it was beyond anything they could comprehend? The creature's eyes locked onto them, its expression twisted in dark amusement. You cannot fight what has already become everything. The process has begun. Suddenly, the cavern trembled with even greater force. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and a massive, glowing pulse of energy shot up from the depths of the earth, illuminating the entire cavern in a blinding flash. Evelyn threw her arm over her eyes, the light so intense that it seared into her vision. Then, just as suddenly, the pulse ceased. The cavern was plunged into complete darkness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then Evelyn heard it, something moving, something stirring around them in the pitch-black darkness. She wasn't alone. The virus, the creature, was everywhere. It was in the air, in the ground, and the walls. It was no longer just a threat. It was the very world around her, pulsing with life. She felt her pulse quicken, her breathing shallow. The darkness seemed to close in, suffocating her, until a sudden, sharp hiss shattered the silence, followed by a deep, guttural growl. The creature's form appeared before her again, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness, its body twisting as though made of smoke and shadow. It moved closer, its form expanding and contracting, shifting with terrifying speed. We are the future, it said, its voice now a whisper of promise. The world will change. You're no longer the masters of your fate. I am." And then, without warning, the walls around them erupted. The earth cracked wide open, and the world above began to crumble, breaking apart as the creature's essence poured into the skies above. Evelyn could feel it now. The world itself was coming apart, not just the facility, but the very fabric of reality. The creature's influence spread like wildfire, consuming everything, shaping everything in its image. There was no escaping it. Dr. Kane stumbled backward, his face pale, his voice cracking with fear. It's over. Evelyn wanted to scream, but the words died in her throat. She could see it now, the vast, sprawling darkness that was the creature, the virus, expanding and consuming everything. There was no escape, no salvation. The world was falling into chaos, and all they could do was watch as the earth was swallowed by the darkness. And just before the last of the light faded, Evelyn understood the truth of what had happened. The creature wasn't just spreading through the earth, it was becoming the earth. And soon, there would be nothing left but darkness. The world around them continued to collapse. The cavern, the earth, and everything in it began to dissolve into an all-consuming darkness. But amid the chaos, a small flicker of light appeared, weak, almost imperceptible, like a dying star in the vast emptiness. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark, but she felt a surge of energy, a sense of purpose deep within her. The creature's presence, though all-encompassing, had left her with a strange clarity. It had overwhelmed them. Yes, but perhaps not entirely. "Dr. Kane," she whispered, her voice rasping through the silence. "Look, there's something there." Kane turned to her, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperation. His eyes flicked to where she pointed, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. He couldn't understand. None of this made sense. Yet, something about the light, the pulse called to him too. The light flickered again, growing brighter. It wasn't an explosion or a flare. It was organic, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing steadily in the deep cavern. "What is it?" Dr. Kane's voice was shaky, but Evelyn could feel his skepticism giving way to something else. Curiosity, perhaps even hope. "I don't know," Evelyn said, swallowing hard. "But we need to move. Now." Without thinking, she started walking toward it, her feet moving through the thickening darkness as if drawn by an unseen force. Each step felt heavy, as though the very ground was trying to hold her back, to stop her from finding whatever the light was. The air was thick, almost solid, and yet Evelyn pushed forward, not daring to look back. She could hear Dr. Kane's footsteps behind her, but the sound of his breathing was ragged now, heavy with the realization that they were facing the final moments of a world slowly succumbing to the creature's will. But as they reached the center of the cavern, where the light seemed brightest, a sudden gust of wind tore through the space, sending a chill down her spine. The air shifted, not naturally, but as if it were alive. Something stirred. Then the ground trembled. A deep, bone-rattling growl echoed through the cavern, and Evelyn turned just in time to see the creature's form shift before her. It had reformed again, its outline growing darker and more massive as it loomed over them. It wasn't the same thing they had fought earlier. This was a new evolution, one far beyond anything they had seen. Its eyes burned with a cold, merciless intelligence. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice filling the cavern like 100 whispers at once. "This world will bend to my will. You are insignificant. Your resistance is futile." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, the creature's words wrapping around her like a suffocating coil. But then something else happened. The light, the flickering pulse, grew brighter, faster. The walls of the cavern cracked with an otherworldly resonance. And in the light's center, a figure appeared. It was tall, humanoid, but its features were different, blurry, distorted, as though it were still forming. The figure raised one arm. and the creature screeched in fury, recoiling as though it had been burned by the mere presence of this light. "You do not belong here." The figure's voice rang out, clear and powerful, cutting through the creature's words like a blade. The voice was both familiar and strange, as though it resonated from some far-off, forgotten place. "I will undo what you have done." The creature writhed in agony, its massive form twisting in impossible angles, as if trying to break free from the light's influence. But the figure did not flinch. Evelyn stood frozen, too shocked to even speak. She had no idea who or what this figure was, but in its presence, she could feel a surge of hope, something more than mere survival. It was as if the light was pushing back against the overwhelming darkness, a final attempt at balance. The figure's hand glowed brighter, its features slowly becoming more defined. There was a strange, serene quality to its movements as it stretched its arm toward the creature. "You have twisted this world for long enough," the figure said. "Now, I will make it whole again." The creature let out a final, tortured scream, its form fragmenting, as if it were being torn apart by some force beyond its comprehension. It thrashed violently, its shadows twisting into violent shapes that seemed to claw at the air itself. But the light grew even brighter, engulfing it entirely. And then, in one blinding flash, the creature was gone. The cavern fell silent. Evelyn stood, still trembling, as the light dimmed. The figure before her began to dissolve, its body dissipating into the air, leaving only a faint echo behind. But it was enough to know the creature was no more. The virus, the entity that had nearly brought the world to its knees, had been erased. For a moment, there was stillness. Then, the ground stopped shaking and the air felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight that had settled over them was gone. The air was fresh, as though the world was breathing again. Dr. Kane blinked, his voice hoarse. "What just happened? What was that?" Evelyn looked around, disbelief still holding her in its grip. She could feel the change. The world was shifting back, slowly but unmistakably. The darkness that had suffocated them had retreated. It wasn't just the cavern that had been healed. It was the entire place, the earth itself. She could feel it deep in her bones. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but I think we've been given a second chance." As she stood there, breathing in the clean air, Evelyn realized something. The creature might have been gone, but the scars it left behind were still there, etched into the fabric of the world. And though the creature had been destroyed, she knew the earth would never be the same. The virus, the creature, the force they had unleashed, it was all too much to be erased entirely. But maybe, just maybe, the world could begin to heal. There was hope now. A small flicker of it, but it was enough. And as she and Dr. Kane turned back toward the surface, toward the world above, they knew they weren't alone in this. Someone had intervened. Perhaps they weren't the last survivors after all. The silence that followed the creature's destruction hung heavy in the cavern, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. Evelyn and Dr. Kane stood side by side, still processing the events that had just unfolded, the weight of everything slowly sinking in. The air felt different now, free from the heavy, suffocating presence that had defined the past hours. It was clean, almost refreshing. The distant rumble of the collapsing facility had stopped, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were no longer being hunted. But there was still a lingering sense of unease, a shadow that couldn't be shaken. As they made their way toward the exit, the faint glow of the bioluminescent veins along the cavern's walls faded, retreating into the darkness. The world outside was silent. "I still don't understand what happened," Dr. Kane muttered, his voice distant. "The creature. It was a virus, a plague, something monstrous. But then that figure, it was like..." Evelyn glanced at him, her thoughts racing. A savior, a force of balance. Whatever it was, it knew how to stop it. But how? He pressed. Where did it come from? Why did it choose now to act? Evelyn had no answers. Her mind struggled to piece everything together The bits of knowledge she had gathered from her time at the facility, the experiments, the virus that had been unleashed. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the answers she sought might never come. Whatever had happened in this underground labyrinth, it was bigger than her, bigger than anything the world had faced before. What if this force wasn't just fighting back the creature? She asked quietly, her voice filled with the weight of a new realization. What if it was also stopping something worse? What if the creature's evolution was just the beginning, and it was trying to spread even more, consume everything? Maybe that figure, whatever it was, saw that too. Dr. Kane paused, staring into the depths of the cavern. You're saying it wasn't just about us? About the virus? Yes, Evelyn said, feeling a surge of conviction. Maybe it was bigger than we thought. Maybe this wasn't just a matter of stopping one monster. It was about stopping the end of everything. Dr. Kane shook his head, looking back at her. I can't even wrap my head around it. I thought we were fighting for survival, for humanity. But if what you're saying is true, the ground underfoot trembled again, faintly. Not as violently as before, but it was there. A reminder that the world they knew was still far from stable. Evelyn felt her stomach churn. The collapse of the facility had only been a small part of the problem. The creature might have been stopped for now, but something told her the balance wasn't fully restored. We need to get back to the surface, Evelyn said, her tone firm. We need to warn the outside world. Whatever that force was, it's not going to stop. The creature, whatever it was, it could come back, evolve again, and it might find another way out. Dr. Kane nodded, his face pale, and together they moved through the winding corridors of the underground tunnel. The echoes of their footsteps were unnerving, the silence between them. Heavy. The further they walked, the more Evelyn felt like they were walking into something else, something beyond the creature they had just faced. Whatever had stopped the creature, it was a force beyond their understanding, and Evelyn wasn't sure whether it was truly their ally or if it had merely chosen to let them live. They reached the exit at last. The steel door that had once seemed so unyielding was now nothing more than a weak barrier, barely hanging on its hinges. Evelyn pushed it open with a sense of finality. As they stepped out into the moonlit night, the fresh air felt both welcoming and unnerving. The landscape around them was eerily quiet. No sounds of human activity. No distant city lights. Just darkness and the faint hum of the wind. Evelyn squinted into the distance. The facility was now nothing more than a burning ruin, the remnants of their nightmare smoldering under the moon. The world had been touched by something darker than they had ever imagined. And now, the real question lingered in the air. What comes next? Dr. Kane broke the silence, his voice cautious. What if it's not over? I don't think it is, Evelyn replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Whatever that force was, it stopped the creature, yes. But I can't shake the feeling that we've only seen the beginning of something far larger. The virus, the creature, it was just one manifestation. There's something more. We don't know if it's gone for good. He agreed, his eyes narrowed. And if it's not, if it evolves again or spreads beyond our reach. We need to warn them, Evelyn interrupted, her voice steady. The world needs to prepare. We have to get back to civilization. We have to make sure that this never happens again. They turned back toward the remnants of the facility, the gravity of their words hanging heavily in the air. The fire burning in the distance cast an eerie glow over their surroundings, as though illuminating a future that was uncertain, fragile. But as they walked back, Evelyn couldn't help but feel that nagging feeling deep in her gut. The force that had helped them. What if it wasn't just protecting the world? What if it had other intentions? What if, in fighting the creature, it had chosen to leave humanity standing for its own purposes? She glanced at Dr. Kane, whose expression mirrored her own growing sense of unease. He, too, had begun to realize the implications. You don't think it's waiting for us? He asked cautiously. Evelyn looked at him. I don't know, Kane, but I can't shake the feeling that this is only the beginning of something much worse. And if it is, we need to be ready. The wind howled through the trees, and Evelyn felt the weight of the world settle around her once more. The future was uncertain. The creature was gone, but its shadow had not disappeared. There was something else out there, something that was watching, waiting, and it wouldn't be long before it revealed itself again. The path back to civilization was long, fraught with uncertainty, and littered with the aftermath of their actions. As Evelyn and Dr. Kane traveled in silence, their thoughts heavy with the implications of what they had just experienced, the night seemed to stretch out before them like a dark, uncharted abyss. The world they once knew no longer seemed the same. It was as if something fundamental had shifted, and they were powerless to fully understand it. The air felt charged, different, almost unnatural. The landscape, though still untouched by the chaos they had witnessed in the underground facility, carried a subtle tension, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the force that had destroyed the creature had not only left its mark on the world, but had also left something unresolved in its wake. "Do you think it's watching us?" Kane's voice broke the heavy silence as they trudged through the rocky terrain. Evelyn paused, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She stared into the distance, eyes narrowed as she searched the horizon. There was nothing but the shadows of the trees, the flickering light of the distant city, and the rising moon. Yet something gnawed at her, an unease that crept into her very bones. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "But I don't think that's the right question. I think we need to ask, why did it stop the creature? What was its purpose? Was it protecting us? Or was it making sure something else didn't break free?" Kane stopped beside her, his face grim. And what if it wasn't protecting humanity at all? What if it's just been waiting for the right moment to use us? The words hung in the air, the chilling thought sinking into her chest like a weight. Was this force truly their ally? Was it just some ancient power that chose to fight back against a threat to its domain? Or was it playing a game with them? A game whose rules they couldn't understand. They continued their journey, the sound of their footsteps now accompanied by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But the world around them seemed too still, too quiet. Every shadow felt deeper, more foreboding, and every crack of the earth beneath them seemed like a warning. As they neared the city outskirts, the lights growing brighter as they approached civilization, Evelyn couldn't shake the sense of something following them, just on the edge of perception. The air around her felt charged. "Evelyn," Kane spoke again, his voice hesitant. "You think we're the only ones who know about this?" She turned her eyes to him. "What do you mean? I mean, if that creature, if it's not completely gone, if it's just hiding, waiting." Kane trailed off. "Someone else has to know. Someone has to be looking for answers, too." She frowned, her pulse quickening. He was right. Even if they managed to escape, they weren't the only ones out there. The world was vast, and secrets, dangerous ones, had a way of slipping through the cracks. What if the facility wasn't the only place where experiments like theirs had been conducted? What if there were others out there who had been exposed to the same unknown force, the same darkness? "We need to warn them," Evelyn said, her voice sharp with newfound determination. "We can't let what happened here repeat itself." Dr. Kane's eyes widened. Warn them? Who? Evelyn's mind raced. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This was bigger than them, bigger than their survival. The world had unknowingly been teetering on the brink of something catastrophic for far longer than they had realized. And now, the force that had destroyed the creature, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but someone has to know what we've learned. Someone has to be ready in case this thing, whatever it is, decides to finish what it started." They made their way into the outskirts of the city, their faces grim as they looked toward the dim lights of the nearest town. The familiar sights, streets, houses, people, seemed almost unreal, as though they'd stepped back into a world that no longer existed. Their world. As they approached the edge of the city, Evelyn's thoughts turned inward. The experience in the underground cavern had left her shaken, yes, but there was something else gnawing at her. A question that had been simmering beneath her consciousness since the moment they first encountered that strange force. What if the creature wasn't the only threat? Dr. Kane seemed to share the same unease. His eyes flicked to her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Evelyn, do you think we could have stopped it?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't need to ask what he meant. He wasn't just talking about the creature. He was talking about everything, the virus, the force that had intervened, the balance that had been disrupted. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "I don't think we could have stopped it. I think we were only ever part of the story, and I don't think the story's over." Just then, the first sign of movement caught her eye, a shadow darting across an alleyway. A fleeting figure that disappeared before she could make sense of it. Her heart leapt in her chest. "Kane," she said quickly, "did you see that?" He looked in the direction she was pointing, but the alley was empty. "See what?" he asked, confused. Before Evelyn could answer, a low hum filled the air. The ground beneath them shuddered once more, and the distant lights of the city flickered. And then a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions. A voice that wasn't human, but unmistakably there. "You're too late," it murmured, the words echoing around them. "The process has begun." Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice. She knew that voice. It was the same voice they had heard deep in the cavern, the voice of the creature, or whatever had taken its place. Dr. Kane's eyes widened in realization, but before he could say anything, the ground cracked beneath their feet and the very air shimmered. The creature, or something like it, was not gone. It had only been waiting for them to return. And now, the real nightmare was about to begin. As Evelyn and Dr. Kane stood frozen, their minds reeling with the sudden realization, the hum in the air grew louder. The very earth beneath them seemed to shift, as if something vast and powerful was awakening. The shadow they had seen flicker in the alleyway, no longer a mere figment of their imagination, was now unmistakable. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and shrouded in a cloak of inky blackness, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost fluid. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest as she watched it approach, the world around them warping with each step it took. "Did you think it was over?" The voice came again, the same deep, resonant tone that had echoed in the cavern, sending shivers down her spine. It was different this time. More alive. More aware. Dr. Kane took a step back, instinctively pulling Evelyn with him, his hand gripping hers tightly. "No, this can't be real. It's impossible." Evelyn's eyes never left the figure, the air around it crackling with an energy she couldn't comprehend. "It's not the creature," she whispered, realization dawning on her. "It's something else." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Then it spoke again, this time with a cold finality. "I am the one who watches, the one who waits. I've been waiting for all of you to return." Evelyn's mind raced. Who was this being? What was it? And why had it waited until now? "Who are you?" Kane asked, his voice shaking. The figure's voice was laced with venom. "You think you understand? You think your feeble attempts to destroy what was unleashed have made a difference? You only delayed the inevitable." With every word, the ground beneath them quivered once more, the distant city skyline flickering in and out as if under some unseen pressure. Evelyn could feel the shift in the atmosphere, an overwhelming force pushing against the very fabric of reality itself. The shadow seemed to grow larger, expanding and contracting like a living, breathing thing. "You're too late," the figure hissed. "The process has already begun. Your world is mine now, and soon it will be whole again." "Whole again," Evelyn repeated, her pulse racing. "What do you mean by that?" The figure reached out its hand, and the shadows around them swirled, twisting into shapes that barely resembled anything human. Faces, eyes, claws, countless forms emerged from the dark, each one twisting and writhing in a grotesque imitation of life. Before your time, before the creation of your world, the balance was disturbed. It explained, its voice low and predatory. A mistake was made. A secret planted. It festered in the dark for eons. It grew, and when it was time, it became the creature you fought. But it was never the true form. I am the true form. Evelyn's heart slammed in her chest. The creature they had fought, this was only the beginning. The true horror had been waiting all along, lying in the dark, dormant. And now it was awake. No, Evelyn gasped, taking a step back. This isn't possible. The figure's form began to distort, its shadows stretching outward like tendrils, reaching for them. You may think you are the ones who can stop it, but you are nothing more than pawns. The world will return to its true order, and you will have no say in it. Evelyn could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on them, the very air thick with malevolent energy. It was suffocating, stifling, and for the first time since the beginning of this nightmare, she felt utterly helpless. Dr. Kane's voice broke through the terror, frantic but determined. We can't let it take over, Evelyn. We have to find a way to stop it now. Evelyn's mind raced. They had already fought the creature, and the force that had helped them seemed to be gone. But the world still trembled under the figure's power, and there was no denying that the creature's influence had only been part of something far larger, far older than they could comprehend. I think Evelyn breathed, trying to steady her thoughts. I think the force we encountered, it wasn't just stopping the creature. It was trying to stop this. This thing, this being, it's the true source of everything we've been fighting. Kane's eyes widened. You're saying this has been pulling the strings all along? That we were never fighting the creature at all? Evelyn nodded slowly, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. Yes, the creature was just a manifestation, a result of the imbalance. But this being is what truly controls it. The figure in front of them let out a low, cruel laugh. You are too weak to understand. This world is already mine, and soon you will be nothing but dust. As it spoke, the shadows around them began to close in, enveloping them in an overwhelming darkness. Evelyn's chest tightened, panic rising within her. They couldn't fight this thing. They couldn't escape it. Then, just as the darkness seemed to swallow them whole, a bright flash of light illuminated the night, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The figure recoiled, letting out a sharp, guttural hiss as it shielded its face. For a brief moment, the oppressive weight of the figure's presence was lifted. The light grew brighter, stronger, and in that moment, Evelyn understood. The force that had intervened in the cavern hadn't abandoned them after all. It was still there, still fighting. The light exploded outward in a blinding flash, and the figure let out a scream of rage, its form unraveling, dissolving into the air. The tendrils of shadow twisted and writhed before vanishing into nothingness. As the light faded, Evelyn and Kane were left standing in the quiet aftermath. The city's lights flickered once more, the hum of the earth returning to normal, and the air felt breathable again. The figure was gone. The darkness had been pushed back, but Evelyn knew that this was only a temporary victory. The true nature of the creature, the true enemy, had not been fully eradicated. It was simply waiting for the right moment to strike again. Still, for now, there was peace, and that was enough. Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands shaking, but she managed to hold her head high. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to Kane. Kane's voice was quiet, but resolute. "Not yet, but we will. We have to." Together, they turned toward the city. The road ahead would be long, and the fight far from over. But at least for now, they had survived, and they would be ready for whatever came next.